Let's build an AI agent with Django, LangGraph, and permit. Now, the idea here, of course, is to have an AI agent that can work with all of the things you might be used to with a standard Django web application. So being able to query the database as a key one, being able to use your users as another key one, and then having all of that work in one of the best tools for creating AI agents, that is LangGraph. So LangGraph itself is a fairly straightforward way to actually just implement tools that you might want to run. What do I mean by a tool? Well, if we look at the actual code that we're going to be building, this is the tool right here. So if we look at search query documents, what we see here is some things that are related to LangGraph, a default lookup inside of Django. We've got some guardrails in here on whether or not this user has permission to even do this, even if it's an agent or not. Then we would serialize some data in a fairly manual way, which of course we talk about other options. But this is a tool. This single tool right here, the AI agent can actually call, which you can see with various agents that we've got in here. Here's a get document agent that we've got in here, which takes in an LLM model, which of course is OpenAI. Then it creates a React agent based off of these document tools. Now, these tools are literally just these functions that are formatted in a very specific way. That specific way allows for your agents to be able to call things. But then we also use a third-party agent, a get movie discovery agent, which means that we actually build out a REST API service to actually call another API. That's it. So now we have two agents going on in here, and then we combine those two agents into a supervisor so that it will decide, hey, should it do an API call or should it do a database call or a database lookup based off of the tools we have? And that is the key part of all of this. We go through step by step into all of these different notebooks to make sure you've got a really strong foundation on how this ends up working. Now, we also take a look at Django permissions. Django itself has permissions built into it that can provide some guardrails in the way of using these agents. But then we elevate it to a whole nother level by using permit.io and the permissions there. I did partner with them on this course, but the idea here is a very simple and straightforward way to have permissions to make sure that your agent isn't going nuts in building things that it should not do or deleting things it should not delete. That's a key part of all of this, making sure that we're using this in a very effective way. Once you have this foundation, you can start adding in all sorts of different tools that your agent or supervisor would have access to doing. I'm really excited to show you this one. Let's take a look at a quick demo as to how it ends up working at the end. Let's do a quick demo as to what we're going to be doing in this project. First and foremost, we're going to create a Django project, have some users, and then integrate it into Jupyter so that we can run various Django related commands like get the user model and actually grab stored Django users. So of course, if I go into the Django admin, I can see a few of the users in here, and obviously I have no documents. Next up, we actually use LangGraph to create something called a supervisor. More on this in a moment, but we see that there is a checkpointer, so it actually keeps track of these things over time. We also see that we have this config in here. This configuration takes in the user ID from Django directly and also has a thread ID so that the checkpointer or the LangGraph session, when we're talking with it, it will remember things based off of this thread ID as well. So with this in mind, I can then go ahead and say something like, what was the most recent Mission Impossible movie? So this is going to do a call of some kind based off of the supervisor. Now I know what this call is, but let's take a look at the supervisor now by going into supervisors.py. We see we've got this get supervisor. We grab an OpenAI LLM model, which of course was going to be the actual one written right here, which is GPT-4o. Then we actually use this supervisor for two different agents. So each one of these agents is dedicated to doing one thing and one thing well. In the case of the documents agent, it has all of these tools to create, remove, update, list documents out. The movie discovery agent has the access to the movie database to search movies and get movie details. Now, whether or not you're going to use this practically is one thing, but the other thing is we see this print statement of searching with user and the user ID, which of course is this right here, right? So it quite literally called that tool and it did so on its own. I didn't ask it to do it. I did a natural language and it went ahead and called that third-party REST API service on its own because of that agent and the supervisor, which is super cool. So in other words, this supervisor knew, based off of that question, call this agent. That agent knew then, based off of the tools that are available to it, to do a quick search for that data, right? And it's actually pretty straightforward as to what happens as a result. And of course, if I get my markdown, here's the most recent movie that it did a search for. Now, this is not the actual most recent Mission Impossible movie. That's not really the point. We could adjust things going forward. We could add things to our agents to make sure that it can get the current time. We can adjust our actual REST API endpoint to make sure that the results themselves are in the correct order, which they might not be right now. So there's a lot of things that I can improve to make sure that this sort of vague question is getting the correct data. But the point is, it's actually getting pretty accurate data here. And so now that we've got this data, I can go ahead and say something like, save that as a new document, right? So it can quite literally take sort of vague instructions to save that as a new document into my Django project. And there it is right there, right? And so there's my new document. It's all saved and it has a bunch of data related to it. Now I could improve this even more by changing the arguments that go into the actual tool function itself. So if we go into create document, all I have here is title and content. It doesn't give me that much stuff. I can change these arguments and all that. And then of course, the actual LLM would have a pretty good job of setting the correct data, which is pretty nice. After we do that, like in this case, it says I've updated the permissions, try to save it again. We could do stuff with permissions as well. So let's go ahead and try this again by getting rid of permissions. So going into permit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into my user here, which is this staff user. I'm going to go ahead and edit this user, and we're going to go ahead and get rid of all permissions. So I'll go ahead and get rid of all these right here. We'll save that, and then I'll go back into my demo here, and now we'll change this to the most recent Lord of the Rings movie. I'll run that one. Once again, it should probably do a search for this user and then give me back whatever that data ends up being in a matter of, a few seconds maybe. It might take a little bit longer depending on latency and all sorts of things, but the idea here is it's giving me this one. I've never heard of this one. I didn't think this was the most recent, but if you do a quick Google search, sure enough, it came out in 2024. So that's actually pretty accurate. Now we're going to go ahead and try and save this movie as a new document. And remember, I've removed all of the permissions. I added in some guardrails here. And so what we'll end up seeing is it won't have permission to do it. It's going to run into an error. Like it had an error saving this. So if we go into the tool itself, we see that we've got this create document and we've got this has permissions here. You do not have permission to do this, which is what's happening right now. We already saw that it did work before, but as soon as I removed those permissions, those roles from that user, I was unable to do it. So let's go ahead and add those permissions back, or at least the admin permission. We'll go ahead and save that. And of course, we can always look at that admin policy and we can see that the document has permission to do all of these things. And in which case I can now go back into my AI agent and say, I've updated the permissions, try to save it again. And in which case it should save it again. And it might do it multiple times. It's possible, but let's go ahead and take a look inside of our document. There it is. And sure enough, there it's now saved. Great. Pretty nice. And we can also say, oh, this one's wrong. So let's go ahead and try this one out. So let's go ahead and say that here's the question. It's not called Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning. Update the correct document to reflect that. This one is a little bit more complex of a request because we just went backwards kind of, and it may or may not remember how to do that. So the thing here is, this is where we start to get into conflicts in general, but what it did was it added a new document and removed the old one. I think that's acceptable. I didn't give it parameters to just update the pre-existing one. It just deleted the old one, which totally works, right? And so in which case I don't need this command at all, but I now see that the documents work. And of course, that's the demo. That's what we're building here. And if I take a look at all of the messages that are going back and forth inside of the agent itself and the supervisor specifically, we can see everything that's going on. It's going back and forth with different agents, and then it's trying to make sense of everything that's going on. So this is happening very, very quickly. And then of course, it actually ends up storing this data for us in the long run. Now, I would say this is probably not how you would manage the actual data that we're trying to store. That's not really the point here. The point here is the AI itself is managing this data. I could say different content. I could go back to that supervisor and say, oh, I want the content to be a summary of this data, right? So if we come back in here and say, I want the content for documents to be a summary of the movie itself, not raw data like you have. Something like that. We can run that then and basically see maybe if that ends up working. Again, these parameters you'd want to tweak because AI is not perfect, not at all, but rather this system that we end up creating gives us the ability to start doing these kinds of things. Whether or not you want to actually store data in your database with that is going to be up to you, right? You may or may not do that. In this case, it didn't actually change anything with that document, it seems, or maybe it did, because now it actually created a couple new documents in here. Okay, so then we could say, remove the old documents that you did not create. So let's go ahead and say, remove the duplicates that you have in the database, or something like that. I'm not sure if that will work, still vague, but the point is we can start experimenting with this and then building out more and more robust tools to make sure that those sort of things are happening a little bit more accurately. But even that, look at that. I didn't really do a whole lot. It just went ahead and did it for me, and it has those summaries in there. That's fantastic. That's so cool that the supervisor can do that. This is like just a very simple demo of something I think very, very powerful. And of course, we could build out user interfaces for this, and I do encourage you to do that. But the notebook itself is a way to go through this user interface. And of course, if there's more robust models out there, try it out with those more robust ones. Try it out with those less robust ones. See how those results end up working. The nice thing about all of this is we have guardrails in place, as in permissions to do whatever we need to do. Then we also have tools that are based in Django that we can really specify what it is that they can do and not do. And we could obviously make these a lot more powerful themselves in terms of permissions, in terms of validation, like when we go to create something, making sure that that title does not exist already, maybe for that user, maybe in general. There's a lot of different things that we can consider doing when it comes to all of these tools. It's just a matter of building them out, which is what I want you to do right now. Let's jump into the course. Let's go ahead and create our Django project using Django 5.2. Of course, that's the latest version of Django. All of these other packages, you should probably just use the latest version of them, which is why my requirements file looks like this. Now, I've already installed all of these packages inside of a virtual environment using Python 3, and of course, in my case, I have Python 3.13. There's a lot of different ways on how you can set this up, and I cover that in other videos. And then, of course, I use the built-in version of Python Virtual Environment Manager, which is venv, just like that. Feel free to use UV or UV using Poetry. There's a lot of different ones that you could use to manage your Python packages, and then just make sure your virtual environment is activated. In my case, I just went like this, and I was able to activate my virtual environment if I'm in the right location for it, right? So in here. And then, of course, I have a code workspace file in here that is, of course, for Cursor or VS Code, either one, or even Windsurf. That way I can see my virtual environment in here at any time. So if I have that venv on the front, that usually means it's already activated, and I won't need to activate it again, thanks to how the virtual environment managers work. And of course, I can verify everything's installed with doing pip freeze. The main one looking for Django itself, just to make sure that that is 5.2 in there. The other thing is Jupyter itself is likely not going to be a production package you would want, so maybe you just keep that one out altogether. In our case, we are going to be keeping it in there based on how we're going to end up using Jupyter in the very near future. At this point, let's go ahead and create the SRC folder in here, and let's go ahead and navigate into that SRC folder in here. You notice that I have venv twice, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that terminal and just have one in there. And then I'll go ahead and do Django-admin start project CFE home period inside of the SRC folder. I hit enter. I call all of my Django projects CFE home so that I know exactly where the settings module is, and in manage.py, it always references that as well. Feel free to change it as you see fit. I recommend sticking with the same one for all of your projects. Next up, what I want to do is I want to make sure that I have a Git repo set up. especially when it comes to using any sort of LLM tool like Cursor or like VS Code's Copilot or Windsurf. There's a lot of things that can go wrong if you are not keeping track of your files. It's more important now than it's ever been. It's always been important, but it's even more important now. So go into the root of your project and go ahead and do git init, and that will create your Git repo here. Notice I have a file called gitignore. This file is a standard file that just ignores certain files in there. I did the Python one from GitHub directly, and then I added dsstore. After you've got that, of course, you could always learn the git commands, or you could just come into the little tab here for git, and you can add any individual file as you see fit. In my case, I'll just go ahead and do git add -- all, and then git commit, and then we'll go ahead and say initial commit. There we go. That is the first part of this. Next, of course, we want to have actual notebooks that we're going to go ahead and use. So go ahead and do notebook folder in here. Inside of this, I'll just go ahead and say hello, or we'll do 1-hello.ipython notebook. And then I'll go ahead and add a new code block. I'll hit Shift Enter, VS Code, Cursor, all of those will ask for a Python environment. I can just go ahead and use my virtual environment one, which of course is what it ends up recommending. So then you can actually do the exclamation mark and pip freeze, hit Shift Enter to run it, and then you'll see all of the same virtual environment stuff in here. And you can always run Python code directly in here. So the important part of this is being able to write Python code directly inside of the notebook, and then also be able to store it for later. So you can actually come back to it. So going back into Git, we can add that in here and say added first, notebook like that, hit commit, and then you can send that to GitHub itself. I'm not going to cover the GitHub part. I will cover using the notebooks and integrating them in with Django. That's probably one of the first things that we want to do so that we can actually use these notebooks directly in line with all of the different Django code. But before we get there, we want to actually have a place to store data about our Django project. And why would we even use Django in the first place with an AI agent? Let's take a look. All of the code is on GitHub at cfe.sh/GitHub, and just look for the Django AI agent. That is what we're building. And so if you need to reference any of the code, feel free to jump there whenever you need to. Right now, what we want to do is build out our first Django model and why that we're creating that model. So what we want to do is jump into the src folder, and then I'll go ahead and run python manage.py, start app, and then you can name the app whatever you like. In my case, I'm going to just call it documents. Now, you can call it all sorts of things, right? Documents is just a general term that I'm using for what I want my AI agent to have access to. So I'm going to be giving the document certain parameters that we will want to save for any given document. So I'm going to go ahead and say my model now is just called a single document, and it's going to be models.model. And then we'll go ahead and add in some stuff in here. So the idea behind apps and models is the app name itself is going to basically collect all of the data or resources around a table, which then is going to be something like your document. So in other words, whenever you want to store data and manage that data, you're likely going to put it into a Django app. I think of it as a component of your Django project. But apps in terms of Django were created a long time ago, well before apps on our phones were a popular thing to do. So it's really just a collection of code that has been already designed, but then it also has some things that are about it when it comes to actually using the data that we're going to end up using. So models in this case are not AI models, but it's rather your database tables, how you're going to be storing this data into a database table. If you think of a database table very similar to like a sheet in a spreadsheet, you're on the right track. Each sheet can have a name like sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3, and then inside of that sheet you have columns and rows. Rows are going to be the actual data most likely, and then columns are going to be the name of that data. The same thing is true in here with Django. So a document itself, you might have something like a title in here, right? And that title is going to have a specific data type. Now, Django doesn't have the simple data types that something like SQL Model does. SQL Model is a lot like Django models themselves, but it makes it a little bit more simple to write out the columns themselves. More on this in just a moment. But the idea here is we want to think through the data types we might want for our actual document model. So title, description, those things might make sense. You also might even have in here like something like content as well. Description being more of like a short description or like a snippet. So those two things might get a little conflated or hard to remember. So I'm just going to leave it as just title and content. Feel free to add those things as you want. And then maybe something like a created at, and this would be a date time object. And then you would maybe want something like updated at, also a date time object. You also will probably want to have a user of some kind, which we'll have to come back to, but this is going to be like a user. And then you also might want to have a publish date or something like that if you plan on sharing it. We're going to try and keep these models as simple as possible. But the idea here is we want to keep track of the user that owns these documents. And then we want to add in arbitrary data like a spreadsheet that's going to basically store that data in a specific way. But unlike a spreadsheet, the reason that we have data types in here is how the database itself, whether it's a SQLite database or like a Postgres database or a MySQL database, the actual column data types are really important when it comes to storing this data. So in that case, we use something called models, and we use actual fields for any given document or model that we're trying to build out. In this case, it's a character field or char field. So if you actually do a quick search for Django char field, what you can see is the model field reference in here, and you can do a quick search for that character field itself, and it'll give you all of the information you'll need about it, right? And of course, feel free to open up your AI chat and have it build out the models for you, but having an understanding of what these things do is fairly important. So a character field is a small amount of data where when you want a lot of data, you use something like a text field. All of these things are going to be still character data, like text like what we've got right here. You could even put code in there. It just wouldn't be code that runs. It would just be treated as just strings of text. Whereas like our user itself, this we actually want to associate to a user. So we use something different, and it's called a foreign key. A foreign key will actually attach two database fields together. It's almost like linking two sheets in an Excel spreadsheet. So we basically link them together so we can do really robust querying, which we will definitely see in the near future. In this case, we want to use the user model itself. So we're going to go ahead and do from Django.conf. We're going to import settings here. And then I'm going to go ahead and declare the user model, and that is settings.auth user model, just like that. This actually gets treated as a string as auth.user, but the reason we use the auth user model like this is because Django treats users differently than every other model. So just keep that in mind. Whenever you want to use a user model, this is the way you're going to do it. And so you declare that user model in there. That's one of the arguments in there. And then for our character field and our text field, well, we want to decide whether or not we're going to leave them blank or how we're going to treat these fields by default. So basically you could do a default value of title, right? And we'll just leave it like that, and we'll see the implications of what that means in the near future. Where the content itself, we're going to go ahead and allow it to be blank and even null in the database, like a completely empty field itself. And so that's pretty much it for those two. Next up are timestamps themselves. Well, Django has a built-in date time field or a date field. Depends on how granular you want on this time. So I'm going to go ahead and bring these things in just like that. So these fields themselves are actually more on the database side. So on the database, we can say, hey, do you want to store it when this document is created, or do you want to update this field when it's updated, when it changes of any kind? So you can have two fields for both things. So in terms of created, we would do, basically, let's see if we even have the auto field help in here. Doesn't look like, oh, there it is, auto now and auto now add. So if we do auto now add being true, this means the database will auto update this field to when it's created. Okay. And where the other one is just simply auto now, this when it's updated. That's it. So those fields will be based off of the database itself, which has time zone, and these are time zone fields. So there are things about that when it comes to Django. So that's how it's going to store that data, which is really nice. There's one more thing I need to update with this owner itself is the question of like, what if we delete a user? What happens to that user's documents? That's really what we're trying to answer there. And so we would do something like on delete, and then we would decide what we want to do with all those documents. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and say cascade, which means delete all of those other documents. Another one I use very often is something like set null, which then allows it to just have an empty user altogether in there. So that field would then be empty, in which case you would have to have null being true. But in our case, we're just going to delete all of the things if that user is deleted, just so we don't like have a bunch of documents in there that are just no longer relevant whatsoever, and also just kind of protects us if a user deletes themselves from our system. We don't want to pay for maintaining their data in any form or fashion. So Cascade is often a really good thing for that. So here is our first Django model. Now, of course, some of you have already done this a lot. Some of you have never done this before. This is a pretty basic model, but it actually allows us to store all sorts of things. And of course, we want our AI agent to be able to work with this model itself. But I do want you to keep in mind that we can add a ton of stuff on here. Let's say, for instance, we want to add a Boolean value like active, saying models.boolean field, and say default being true. We now have a flag that we can say, oh, just get the active documents, the ones that I'm currently working on, make sure that those are available. Or turn off all of my old documents after, like, I don't know, or before June 1st of 2025. Turn all of those off, in which case it would go off with the created at, and then it would turn off all of those documents. So there's really a lot that you can do in terms of these fields. Once again, thinking like a spreadsheet itself, we're really just adding new fields on here. Now, one of the important parts about designing these, though, is you don't really want to change them that often. You can change them, but you just don't want to do it that often. If you start changing these too often, then you're going to really muddy up your database itself. So really just think through what it is that you want in this document model or in this document table, and then you would go from there to then solidify these changes in that table so then you can start adding data, which of course we have not done yet. But the idea here is this is now our document model. What we need to do next is actually install this into a database of some kind. Let's take a look. When we use web applications, we typically don't write database schemas directly. We use something called an ORM. Now, we've actually already designed our object relation mapping right here. So the object itself is this document class in Python. The mapping are all of these fields that we wrote, and then Django will actually translate these into SQL, that's SQL, that will actually then allow for us to create this as a database table in SQL. It will also allow for us to add, remove, update, and list out all, and even search all of the items that are related to this, but just by writing Python itself. ORMs are very powerful in terms of a concept because they abstract away a lot of the database code that's going on underneath, but are still very, very approachable depending on the language that you end up using, of course. So ORMs are not Python or Django specific, but it's rather a concept that allows you to connect your code to database code. In this case, the database code that we're going to be using is going to be the default inside of Django, which if you scroll on down in Django, you'll see that it is SQLite. In the long run, I recommend using Postgres. That's what I use for everything, or something like Postgres. Tools that I also really like are Neon and Timescale, and then even just the Docker Postgres as well. Those are a lot of ways on how you can get Postgres, or you could even just install Postgres directly from Postgres binary and all that. But managing a database is maybe something you want to do, maybe not. In our case, we're not doing it. We're just going to be using SQLite itself. Now, as it pertains to an AI agent, we could just feed that AI agent the database table directly. But in our case, we are not going to do that. Instead, we're going to be using these models and all of the things you can do with these models inside of Django, which I think gives a huge benefit. So with this in mind, we have an app called Documents. Inside of that app, we have a model called Document, right? So the app name is going to be plural. The table name is going to be singular. Each item in there will be related to that singular item. That's typically what you end up doing. So you typically do not call this documents because basically what you're going to do is you're going to add one document at a time, and thus it's called documents. That's really the key there. Okay, so how do we actually install this into a database? Well, first off, what we can do is we can just make sure that Django has access to the database itself. The way we do that is by running python manage.py migrate. We hit enter here, and we can see that it's applying all sorts of things. You may not know what this is yet, but I'll talk about it in a second. But the important part is we see there's content types auth. If you know what that means, that's a good sign. All sorts of auth, but you can also see alter user email max length, alter user username options, and so on, right? So Django already has users built into this. This is one of the things that really sets it apart from pretty much every other web framework that's out there. But so what does this applying actually do, and what are these migrations? So migrations are just a term of saying like, hey, our Python code is now going to be updating our database code itself. So if I were to run python manage.py migrate again, we won't see those migrations because they've already taken place. They're already done in the database. And of course, the question then would be, where is that database? It's this db.sqlite3 right here, according to the setting itself. So we've got a base directory here in db.sqlite3, and that's going to be this location. If you open up python manage.py shell and just print out the base dir, it probably won't work. You probably have to need to do from django.conf import settings and then settings.base and dir and hit enter. You can see the actual location as to where that file should be. So we are combining the base directory here with that file name. So the reason I mention this is because you will see the db.sqlite3, it is grayed out. That is, it will not be on the Git repo ever if you do it correctly and you have a git ignore, which I do have. Now, one of the things that you want to get comfortable with doing is deleting your databases. This, of course, deletes all of the data in there, but as soon as you delete that database, you just run python manage.py migrate again, and it will create them all over again. It will apply all of the migrations or all of the changes that need to happen to that database. And of course, if I run this over and over again, we're not going to have any issues whatsoever. So the question, of course, is our actual database table in there, the one we created called document? And of course, it is not, because if you look in the migrations folder, it has nothing in there. So we want to create our migration itself before we run our migration. So we're going to go ahead and do something like python manage.py make migrations and hit enter, no changes detected. So what's happening here is Django's looking throughout all of the code, looking for changes inside of the apps themselves, like in models.py. But it's not detecting any of those changes because, well, this app is not installed. We need to go into settings.py, and we want to scroll on up to where installed apps are. And then you just want to bring in the app name, which in our case is documents, right? So just that name right in there. We go ahead and save settings.py. We open up our terminal again and we hit make migrations. Now it does this migrations for document. We did not change the database yet. All we did was create the Python file that we can use to change the database. So basically what we saw before with all these migrations, it's going to be similar to that. We'll see that again in a moment. But if I look in this actual migration file itself, these are all of the changes that are going to take place really, really soon to our Django database tables and database itself. So basically to whatever configuration we have here. So if we ever change our database, we will need to make sure that we are running our migrations. If we ever change our models, we need to make sure that we are running our make migrations and then our migrations. So what we got here is python manage.py, and then we'll go ahead and hit migrate. This now applies those migrations very similar to what we saw before. But we now have two amazing facts. One fact is inside of settings.py, this document itself is now inside of installed apps alongside of all of the other built-in Django apps that are in there. So if I were to delete my database table now, or db.sqlite, and run migrate again, I'm going to see all of the original ones that we already saw and our new one, which is this right here. So what we're seeing in here are changes to the database tables themselves that have happened over time that exist in the code itself, inside of the Django code, which you could always inspect and look at as well. Let's take a look at what that means to actually change a database table so that you have a sense as to how that works, because sometimes you'll need to change it. Sometimes you'll want to change it. Sometimes you'll be like, oh, I need to make new fields in here. I want to see how that's done. Let's take a look at how we can now change pre-existing database tables that have already done their migrations. In other words, when we run Python manage.py and hit migrate, we can see that there's none to apply. And of course, this actual app is already in installed apps. So when we want to make changes, if we want to add a new field in here, we need to be aware of the things that happen when you add a new field. The database and Django right now think in terms of this already exists. There might be one row in there. There might be 10 million rows in there. So keep that in mind as we make changes to our models. So let's say, for instance, I want to change this active, and we'll go ahead and say something like active at, like is active at, or something along those times. The reason I'm going to go ahead and do _at is mostly just to have that being basically what a timestamp or time field would end up being. So in this case, what we would have is not auto now add being true. So we'll go ahead and say that being false. Also, auto now is also false because we want this field to be set based off of the active field itself. So there we go. We just made some slight little changes here. And so what we want to do is we made changes to our Django models. So we want to go ahead and run Python manage.py, and we'll go ahead and do make migrations. This is basically telling Python Django that we are about to change our database. If I hit enter here, it's going to say it's impossible to add a non-nullable field, active at, without a default. Okay, so remember how I said it might have one row, it might have 10 million rows? This is what that's all about. So in the case of how I set this up, this field has to have a value. It has to have a value that is either a default value or a null value. So if you do a null value, that means that it doesn't have a value in the database, but in terms of my code, it has to have one of those two things because we are adding this later. This is being changed. This is changing our database table itself because we've already run those migrations. It already has everything in there. So we have options at this point. We can specify a default right now, or we could quit this process of making those migrations and then specify those things in here. I recommend getting used to just quitting and doing it right in the code, unless of course you're a little bit more advanced, in which case you probably wouldn't listen to that anyway and you'd go with the one-off defaults, which is totally fine. It's just for those of you who don't know how to do this, I recommend putting it directly in the code. So the reason I also already had a default and a null value in here was to show you that we can change these things. So if I didn't want active to have a value itself, I could just go ahead and say null being true. That means in the database, this can be an empty field. In my case, I want to go ahead and have this to be an actual value, some sort of value in there. I want it to have a default value for when this is happening. So the default value in my case will be just simply timezone.now. Now, timezone is built into Django itself, so we can go ahead and do from Django.utils, and then we can import the timezone itself, timezone.now. This can be a callable. In other words, we could have a function in here and say something like set my default value, and then I can return back what that value would be, which would be something like timezone.now. And the reason I have that spelled incorrectly is because you can just put it in like that. Django itself is intelligent enough to actually make that call, to actually call that function itself for that default. But as soon as I put a default in here, that means that that value is going to be basically the same as this created at until I make something different, right? So these two fields are almost identical. Actually, it's probably closer to the updated at field. So I will show you how we solve that in just a moment. But at this point, I now have a default in here. So I go to make migrations again. And now what I see is a new file comes in. This new file is showing me all of the things that need to happen to this right now. It's adding this field in here. the migration field for the document active. Notice that this is something that I accidentally didn't migrate before. Maybe you caught that, maybe you didn't. I certainly didn't, which is why we're seeing that active field being an added one and also active at being an added one itself. We don't have that error anymore, or that, basically warning, hey, stop doing this, whatever you're doing. But now we can actually run Python manage.py, migrate, and hit enter. Okay, so we're not quite done with this active at field though. It actually means we not want to do one more thing, and that is basically overriding how this thing is saved by doing something like save, and we'll do self args and keyword args. Do keep in mind that this right here is the default method, and we will absolutely see save later, but this right here, I didn't change anything. So if I want to modify something before it's actually stored in the database or update in the database, we would say it right before the super call of save. We could say something along the lines if self.active, and then we can actually go ahead and do self.active at and do timezone.now. Now, this is a good example of every time it's saved, it's going to change it to active at. So this is a little bit more like updated at. So really what we want to do is then come in here and say else, and then self.active at equals to none. So I now see, oh, if it's inactive, I actually want my default to be different than this, because I want to be able to set it to none. In other words, I'm going to change this default, get rid of that altogether, and we'll just go ahead and go back into being null. Null and none are the same. Null is for the database, none is Python. So there we go. So now we've got a much better field. So if it is active, it's going to go ahead and set that time zone. If it's not, then it's going to go ahead and remove it. But the other thing that we want to know is basically saying something along the lines of and is active at is none. So basically it's active and is active at, or the active at field is also none, because it can be. That's the only time we want to set it. Not every single time this thing's saved. That's going to be our updated at field. This right here is what makes this different than the updated at. This also makes it different too, but overall, we are now in a good spot to make one more change. We did make a change to the model. So once again, we're going to do something like Python manage.py, make migrations. We see that it gives us another field in here. It alters this field. It allows it to be nullable in here. And then we run migrate again. And now those changes take place. This save method in here doesn't actually matter so much in terms of the migrations. In fact, we could turn it off altogether like that by commenting it out. But this overriding of the save method is really powerful in the long run. I'm not really going to talk about it much more, but if you need to change fields based off of other fields, this is a really good way to do it. Do it right in line of that save method, because it is called in a lot of places. Once again, we will see that. Now, the biggest caveat to all of these migrations is if you change your database. Let's say, for instance, I change my database to DB2, and then I want to actually start all over. I'm going to do a new database, and I'm going to go ahead and run Python manage.py, migrate once again. And then I'm like, oh, wait, actually, I only want one migration here. I don't want three. So I'm going to just change some stuff. I'm going to go ahead and delete this here. And then I'm going to go ahead and come in here. And I'm going to delete all of those migrations that I just created. Then I'm going to go ahead and run migrate again. And let's go ahead and run make migrations first, actually. So we actually create the migration table. And now it has all of those fields in the way that the current state of it is. So I actually made a bunch of problems for db2.sqlite 3. So do keep in mind that that can happen. I'm actually going to leave it like this so that we actually have just the one single migration going forward. Hopefully you have some confidence now going forward with actually running and deleting migrations. This is why I mentioned before, when you're designing these tables, that you want to spend a good amount of time making sure you've got it right. In my opinion, we now have it right. The database itself has come and gone, but now I think we're in a good shape for the actual model itself. So this is how I'm going to leave it. The key part of all this is you can make database changes. As soon as you make those changes, you need to run make migrations, and then you need to make sure that the database knows about them by running migrate. That's exactly how that ends up working. But at this point, we now have our document model. It's time to start moving towards actually using this model in a more automated fashion, as in within an AI agent. If you only plan to use Django for the ORM, you're missing out on a key feature, and that has to do with users. We're going to take a look at that in a second. But if you plan on using Python and only an ORM, what you want to really look at is something called SQL Model and SQL Alchemy. These things were created after Django and are inspired by this ORM in there. These ones do not have users out of the box. You would have to actually bring that in otherwise, which is totally possible. But I want to show you one of the reasons why I like using Django, and it has to do with the Django admin and, of course, Django users. So if we come into our project here and run python manage.py, and we do something called create super user and hit enter, this will allow for me to create my very first user in here, and then you can actually go through the process of putting a whatever password in here and duplicate it again. So I created a super user. Where it was stored is in db.sqlite3. So if I delete that database again, that user is gone. You need to do it all over again. Okay. So of course, db.sqlite3 is the database we're using. The same thing would be true about other databases. So if you had other databases on there and you deleted those databases, all of that data is gone, including all your users. Just to reiterate that point. Now what I want to do is I want to run python manage.py run server. This is a development server that we can use to access Django itself. Now, Django has all sorts of things about it that you may or may not use. One of those things that you probably will use is the Django admin. And it should look something like this, and it says username and password, in which case we want to put in our whatever password here and that username, and you should be able to see this right here. So this is the Django admin. This is a way to administer your database, but through Django and various permissions that Django has built in to it. What I want to do is actually build in my documents. I want to add in documents in here. So I want to have this document model in my Django admin. And it's really easy to do. You go into admin.py, you import the model class. So from .models, we're going to import the document class itself, which of course is a Python class. Then we use the admin function that Django has with admin.site.register of that document. That's it. That's all you need to do. As soon as you do that, you now have documents in here and you can add documents in. You can select your user here and you can say, hello world, this is awesome. And you can add whether or not you want active at. I'm not going to touch active at. I'm going to hit save and continue. It says this field is required. Ooh, I made a mistake in here on my models.py, and that is I'm going to go ahead and say blank equals to true in here. Blank itself has to do with the Django fields that get rendered on their own. As soon as I change that, notice it's not solid anymore like the other required fields in here. So now I can go ahead and say hello world and of course add my user, and we'll go ahead and hit save and continue editing. Now it automatically sets is active at or active at time, which is of course happening because of the save method here. We will talk about this again in the future, but it allows for us to see it in real time. I can toggle that and it keeps track of that toggle when that actually happened, which is super cool. Another thing about it is you could potentially even add something further, as in active, like active at change user. Well, spelling's off a lot. You could add in something like this where you're keeping track of the user that actually changed it, which I'm not going to be doing. That's definitely a little bit more advanced than what we're trying to do here. But the point of this is to be able to actually access our Django document inside of the Django admin through a user. So there's already some permission in there that you may want to have. We're going to create another user very soon to see those permissions in place, at least at a fundamental level, because access, authorization, permissions, these things we definitely need to be well aware of when it comes to actually building out tools that will automatically grab this data for us, not just our users. Nevertheless, we now have this document in here, but I made one critical error. As I told you before, if you make any changes to your models, or if you change models.py at all, what you want to do is close out your server with Control-C. You want to run python manage.py. What is it called again? Make migrations, and then python manage.py migrate. You want to make sure you run those every single time. You want to keep track of your migrations over time so you can change things or make sure that they're doing it correctly or go backwards in time if you make issues or errors. The tracking of these migrations is important, especially even if you're just altering one little thing, in our case with blank being true being added. We're going to integrate Django with Jupyter Notebooks. The reason I do this is so that I have an interactive way to run things related to Django, not just Python, right? So what we saw before when we set things up, it was really just Python specific. It was not Django specific. So the real question here is if we were to copy this one and do something like Django Users perms, we would be able to essentially say from Django.contrib.auth, we would import something called get user model, and then you would say something like user equals to get user model, and then user.objects.all. And then you'd run that and of course add in the virtual environment itself. What you see here is Django's not configured basically, at least for the notebook itself. So we want to have it configured. Now, the other reason as to why we want a notebook is because it's a lot easier than using the Django shell. So if you go into the shell, you can test things out really easily in the shell, and even easier now than ever because you can just go ahead and say user.objects.all, hit enter, and you'll get all of the users in there versus doing this import like I did for users. This is true for permissions as well. So if you do permission.objects.all, you can see all of the available permissions that a user could have or groups could have inside of Django. So we'll come back to the permission stuff at some point. For now, we want to just take a look at how to actually connect Django within this notebook right here. There's a number of options and third-party packages that make this possible. The way I do it is by just creating a setup module in Python, and that setup module is going to be a few straightforward lines for this one. First and foremost, a few default imports. These imports and the setup process overall is very similar to manage.py, as you can see in here within manage.py itself, and then also other things related to Django like wsgi.py as well. So a lot of similar things going on there, but the point here is we need to make sure that we know our paths here. So the notebooks directory is going to be this folder right here. And then the repo directory, the parent project directory, is this one right here, which is what these are. And then we've got our Django root, src, and then CFE home, the name of our Django project, and then .settings, right? So those are the key ones. You want to make sure that those are correct. Then you do some things with async.io. If you have neat async.io installed, this will allow for looping and certain things in there. That's definitely optional, this whole block. That's why it's in the try exception block. And then we also have the ability to actually just import and run Django inside of a Jupyter notebook. So I'm going to go ahead and save it. Now what I'm going to do is jump back into this to Django users notebook here. I'm going to go ahead and create another code import here. And we're going to do import setup and then setup.init. So this setup is literally notebooks/setup.py, right? So that's exactly what we're doing. We're importing that thing right there. We hit enter there. This should run just fine. And now I should be able to get all of my users. So now using Jupyter Notebooks, we can go forward and actually do all of the things you might need to do within your Django project itself. It kind of allows you to experiment a lot with it, which is something I recommend if you're using just Django anyway, so you can get a sense as to what's going on. In our case, we're going to do it to help actually create our AI agent within Django, right? So to actually build that part out, we want to test it with some sort of interface. One of the easiest ways to do that is inside of these notebooks. I went ahead and ran the Django development server again so I can go into the Django admin and really highlight what permissions are all about. The permission to actually log into the Django admin is a privilege that you can grant to any user. Let's see that process with code right now. Of course, you can use the Django admin to do this as well. You can create users directly in there, but I want to do it with code at this point. So going back into our Django users perm notebook, I'm going to go ahead and run these two lines here. What we should see is something like query set or even an empty query set like that, depending on what your database is at this point. We are now going to go ahead and create a brand new user, and we're going to do it from a manual Python perspective to start. then we'll build on top of it using some of the Django stuff itself. So even if you don't know what query sets are yet, we'll get into that at some point. So the idea here is I'm going to create a brand new user object, right? And so how do we create a user object? Naturally, we're going to use the user class, which is what this right here is doing. It's a special way to get the special user class. It's not quite like the document class, which we'll do in a second too, but it is just the user class. So if you're familiar with Python, you know that you can actually initialize a class by using parentheses and then passing different arguments in here, like username equaling to, let's say, staff, right? And so that's one of the ways on how you could actually go about creating an instance of a class. But this one is not in the actual database yet. It is an instance of the user class, but it's not in the database, which we can test by going back into the Django admin, into the users. We see that it's not in there. So if I actually do user object.save and hit, parentheses and then shift enter, then I refresh in here, I now see that that user has been stored. So as you may recall, I talked about save methods before. This is an example of that save method being triggered. There's a pre-save and then also a post-save. This hopefully is ringing a little bit of bells into what we did with documents and this save method right here. So what I could do is I can actually take this user object, and now because of foreign keys, I can actually create a document related to it. So I'm going to go ahead and now do the document import, and that is going to be from the documents module. So documents dot, so that's going to be this module right here, and then dot. Notice that I got some pre-filling here. This is of course because of cursor, but then we do from documents.models, we're going to import the document class here. So in this case, this is, when I said it's from cursor, I don't mean it's from AI. It's just cursor's autocomplete, something that's been around for a long, long time. So cursor hasn't, but VS Code has, autocomplete has. So now we're going to go ahead and create a new document. So just like the user, we're going to go ahead and do our doc object or doc obj. This is how we can start or initialize the object class. Then we can pass in the fields or the arguments you might want for that document. So if we go into documents here, jump into models, we can see here's the class, here are all the arguments that you can pass in. Owner being one of the first ones that you would pass in, that owner being a user class, a user object, because of this right here. That is the foreign key to that user. I do realize the import here is different. This import is only for models. Everywhere else, it is this import. That's a critical piece for users only. For everything else, you import it directly from the model class itself. Okay, so now we've got document in here. Next up you want to do is you want to bring in the things that are required. So title is required, and I think that's the only thing. So owner and title, great. So let's go ahead and add in title here, and I'll go ahead and say hello world, and then we'll go ahead and initialize that object or instantiate an object. This is not saved. So you're probably wondering why it says document object none instead of something like staff or the username itself. That has something to do with how we defined our Django model, which we can modify in just a moment just to see what that looks like. But the important part here is we didn't actually save it. So if I do .save here now and hit enter, this will now be entered into the database itself, which of course you could have verified inside of here. But now if I look at the document object itself, it now gives me the ID inside of that object itself. So we can actually customize this string here to something different. So if we go into our document model, we can define the str method in here, and we can return back what we want to return in here. So let's say, for instance, we wanted to do some string substitution. You could do something like document and then self.title. And then in this case, self is referencing the instance of this document, right? And then .title. So it's going to that actual field. So in other words, when we look at this, this is almost like that. It's very close, but instead it's saying document object and then the ID in parentheses. So if I were to restart this, let's go ahead and do that because I made changes to the models. One other thing that you might be like, oh, I just made changes to the models. What should I do here? Of course, you're going to want to run python manage.py, make migrations, and then python manage.py migrate. Notice it didn't say any changes were made, but I made a rule of if you ever make anything if you make changes to models.py, you want to run make migrations and migrate, even if you're unsure of whether or not you need to do that. But we made those changes. Now we've got this document. I refresh this notebook to clear out everything and restart my notebook session, which means I need to reconnect to Django, rerun the query session, take a look at the user object. In this case, I'm not going to save this user object because it already exists. So we'll leave that as is for a moment. I'm also not going to save the document object, but instead I will just go ahead and run it. Notice it's now saying that hello world like I mentioned before. So this is that str method that's coming through. So I might want to change that a little bit to, instead of having these parentheses and all that, but rather just have it as string substitution, which is where you can kind of play around with that as sort of a representation of that document itself. So once again, we run all of those steps. Now we can see this is an instance of the document class, and it has an str of hello world. Of course, we could also still have the document object in there, but overall, this is the general idea of how we can actually start working with some of these classes in just pure Python. So the only Django thing in here really is this right here. Everything else is really just Python. The .save method is something we also wrote in Python. So it's kind of like not really Django. This is not Django-esque. What you would do instead with Django would be document.objects.create, and then I'll just go ahead and say owner equals to the user. So I want to grab a user object. This is not a valid user object. So let's go ahead and grab a single user object. The way we're going to do this is by saying user obj equals to user.objects.first. And that will do a database query and grab that user object, the very first one. You could also do .last. You could also do get ID equals to 2. The reason I'm guessing ID equaling to 2 is because this is the second user I created. But there's a lot of different queries we can do here and we can talk about later. But I'm going to just grab the last user in here. This is now going to be my owner for a new document. I go to run this. This goes ahead and creates a new document. If I try to do the same thing in the Django admin, hit add document and hit staff and hit save, it does the same thing. Why is it that it didn't require me to add a title? That's because I added a default in here. I did not change the title at all. It just went to that default. If I wanted to get rid of that default, I would need to, like what I would do with the user. So let's go ahead and do the same thing, document.objects.create. This time I'll just say title equals to ABC. I'll run that. Now I get an error, not null constraint found. The owner ID doesn't exist. In other words, we never actually set the owner. So the nice thing about Django itself is we can do owner, the actual object itself, the actual instance of that class, or I can use something like owner, not order, but rather owner ID. So it could be owner, the object itself, or ID being 1 or whatever the actual owner object ID would be. So once again, we can grab that with owner object.id, and there we go. So I can use whatever that value is to also set it as that user. This is one of the amazing things about doing foreign keys, in which case I now no longer have an error. Okay, so this is how we can create instances, but it's not really showing us how to do the permissions of it all. So we definitely want to see that, and we'll do that with our user objects still in this notebook, because this is more of like fundamental Django querying into the ORM. So what we've seen so far is a list query. This is a list. This is just a get and a retrieve method from the database, and it's just listing out a bunch of things. This right here is also a get. So it's also get, but this is more of a detail get because it's getting one object. This is a list of objects. This is one object. Then the save method, this could be create or update, right? Depending on what we did prior. So when we did this one, it was create. When we do this one, it would be update. So if I was using the same one and just called save on it, that's updating it, right? And then of course, there's also a delete method as well. So if you wanted to delete a user, you could do it with simply .delete. We'll come back to these things, but knowing how to do this is something that we'll continue to build on. I realize some of you that are more advanced in Django, this is incredibly basic, but I realize also that we need to understand these things prior to implementing any sort of AI that will be able to do this stuff as well. Let's create another user that can actually log in to the Django admin. And we're going to do this using code. So of course, the way we're going to do this is in that same Jupyter notebook. We're going to go ahead and run the first two cells here. This time, instead of it being this one, I'm going to go ahead and do .objects.create of that user. And this user is going to be Ethan Hunt. Okay. And so in here, I'll go ahead and create this user, and there we go. So what I want to do with this user is to allow them to log in. And there's two ways on how we could do this. We could jump into the Django admin and say something like staff status or super user status, or we could do it in code. So let's see how we do it in code. The way it's done is by actually modifying the user itself. So one of the things you might do from time to time is just run help on any given class, run that class, so you can see all of the attributes of that class. So let me just scroll on up to it to the very top where things are defined. We've got our user here. We've got a few different methods and objects that are related to this user. And we've got this one that I wanted to do right here, and that is staff. So what I'm going to do here with our user object is I'm going to change it so that we have user object.isStaff and set that equal to true. Okay, so I probably don't want to create this user again. In fact, I also don't want help to show up again, but it is nice to know about it. So let's go ahead and run this again. But this time, instead of create, I'm just going to go ahead and say get. Right? So create creates the user, of course. Get will get the user. And I will leave this in here as a comment for the create method here. And so as soon as I run this now, I should see that Ethan Hunt is staff. So if I run that, I see that that's true. Now, if I were to restart this whole thing again, comment out the declaration, and then run it all again, what I will see is it's false because I didn't do something. Do you remember what I didn't do? Yes, that is user obj.save. Now, if I run this, it will change that to being is staff. I go back into the Django admin, do a quick little refresh here. I see that staff status has now been checked. Great. So now this user, in theory, should be able to log into the admin site. But there's a thing missing, and that is the password. So let's go ahead and set this user's password. So user object.setPassword is a method that's built in, which again, you could use help to find that method, or just take my word for it, either way. And then I'm going to go ahead and say ABC123007, which is hilarious, but maybe not. Okay, so what we've got here now is I'm going to set a password. As soon as I do that, notice that the Django admin uses a salting algorithm, or basically does not store the raw password, but rather does this, in which case I can actually come in here and try to take a look at that password itself. I don't actually see the ABC123007. Great. So let's go ahead and actually log in as this user. Back into our Django admin, we're going to go ahead and log out. Let's log in again. This time we're going to go ahead and do Ethan_Hunt, ABC123007, hit enter. I'm able to log in. You can say this password if you like, but I don't have permission to do anything, right? So this at its core is a basic permission. This right here, it's a Boolean value, can log in to admin or not, or rather the Django admin or not, right? And so if I were to change this to false and run this again, I refresh in the admin, I no longer have access to do that. I try to log in and it's going to say, hey, you don't have permission to do this. This user can still log in. This user can still be authorized to do other things, but it just simply cannot go into the Django admin unless I toggle that permission itself. And so this is by far the most basic permission that Django gives you out of the box. If they're logged in, and then you can add some sort of Boolean on an object on whether or not they can have access. So the same idea in here inside of documents, right? So we could say something along the lines of basically like require staff, and this would be models.boolean field in here as well. And then we could basically do roughly the same thing in our lookup process. This right here is permission I don't recommend doing, but from a logic perspective, you could think of it going down that rabbit hole. This gets really hard to manage really quickly, really easy to manage with one document class. Really hard to manage once you get into a lot more things that are not related to this one single Boolean. So we have another option in here that we can move towards, which we will. We're going to see some of the basics of Django permissions. But the point here is we can now adjust how our users work on the fly directly with code. And of course, setting password, this you would probably use a Django form or an HTML form or some sort of API request to set that one time, and then that user has a password and they'll be able to log in and do all sorts of stuff. This is just something that is outside the scope of what we're trying to do here. Now let's actually take a look at some of the built-in permissions that Django has so we can go a little bit further with this than what we currently have. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the built-in Django permissions beyond is staff to be able to log into the admin. So these built-in permissions are fairly straightforward, but they are limited to Django, which is good and bad, which we'll talk about soon. But the idea here is we want to grab our users. So first and foremost, let's take a look at what our super user has permission to do, what their permissions are. First off, the super user is going to be basically the admin user, right? So super user equals to admin user, and you probably don't want to have too many of them. If you recall, we created this user with Python manage.py, and it's simply create super user, which is also the same thing as doing user.objects.create underscore super user, which takes in a few other arguments and stuff like that, which we're not going to cover right now. But the idea is let's grab an instance of that user by saying something like our super underscore u equals to the user.objects.filter. And we would say something like is admin being true, and then we would grab the first object of that. Instead of the list, we would grab the very first one. If I run this, I get an error. Now, the keyword itself is admin is not a field. It gives you the actual choices in here, what fields are valid. Notice there's one called user permissions. We're going to look at that in a second. But there's also one called document, right? There's all sorts of ones in here. And so the is super user is the actual field we were looking for. So if I run that now, I can see that it doesn't give me an error. Instead, it gives me the actual user object itself. Now, why is it that I even showed you that? Because every once in a while, if I forget what a field is in any given model, I just put some gibberish in to see exactly what the field options are. So saying something like is super user is useful if you know what it is. If you don't, just do that object. Okay, so what I want to see here though is I also want to see this user's permissions. There's two ways to get this user's permissions because of how Django works. One of the ways is by using the user object itself and doing a reverse query set, which is basically doing dot notation to that user permissions and then dot all. This right here, I could filter things down to, but I'm going to go ahead and run that and I can see it's an empty query set. This super user has no permissions attached to it. But the thing is, it is the admin user, so it has all permissions by default just because of this one field right here. But if we were to change this to the staff user and only the staff user, let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to copy this right here. And we'd say something like staff u. We would want to do is super user being false and then is staff being true. This will allow me to see the staff user being Ethan Hunt, which of course is the one I have logged in to the admin, as we can see here. This user has no permissions as well, because by default, there will be no permissions, right? And so if I take a look, there are the no permissions. So how do I actually add permissions in here? Now, the way we're going to do this is by importing the actual permission class. There's a full-on model specifically for permissions. So if I actually import it from django.contrib.auth, I can take a look at all of the permission QSs or permission query sets. So I'm going to call this perms QS equals to permission.objects.all. And then I can go ahead and take a look at what those permissions are. There's a ton of them in here. And so what we want to do then is we actually want to filter this down. So once again, I could say some gibberish equals to some other gibberish. and hit enter, and I can see it can't resolve it. Instead, it has only these items right here. So notice we've got a user in there. Interesting. We also have code name, which is what we actually want. But before I even get to the code name, let's see what it is that we want to look at. So if I change it to all again and just do for obj in perms QS, I could print out obj.codename. And if I run this, I can see the pattern that emerges from how these permissions are designed. We see that it's add underscore, add underscore, add underscore, and so on to all of the different models inside of Django. In other words, by default, all of the Django models have permissions that come in by default, right? And all of these permissions correspond to what the user can do, at least in the Django admin for sure. This could also be done in the Django project itself, like your own views, your own APIs. You can do all sorts of things with the permissions themselves. But in the admin itself, we have a bunch of permissions that we can use. So I want to use some of these permissions, and I want to set them to my staff user using code. Of course, I can always log in as my staff admin super user and then set the permissions manually, but we're going to do it with code directly. So the way we are going to do that is by filtering this down. So I'm going to change the filter, and we're going to again use code name. This time I'm going to go ahead and do 2 underscores and I contains equaling to, I'll do all caps of view. Notice that these are all code names. All caps of view does not come in here. If I were to run this, then I see all of the views in here. So I contains just means that it's case insensitive. Whereas if I change it to just simply contains, well, it still gives me that exact thing. So I contains sometimes is good, sometimes is not. The way you do these queries, you're going to want to play around with. But the idea here is now I've got a bunch of view permissions in here as this query. So what I can do is I can go one by one on them and add them to my staff user. So I can come in here and say staff user.add that actual permission, just like that. I can go ahead and run this, and that should add it to that staff user. Let's go ahead and jump back into the Django admin, and there we go. This staff user can now see all of these things. So I can actually come in here into the document. Notice there's no button for delete. There's no button for create. I can only see items in here, which is pretty nice. It's pretty powerful that I can see some of these items in here. Looks like I can reset the password for maybe all users, but then again, maybe not. The button is there. I just can't touch it. I can't do anything with it. So I literally only have view permission. Now there's another way to set permissions as well. So if I removed all these, let's go ahead and remove them all. And then we can refresh in here. And once again, it's back to being forbidden. I don't have permission to do it. There's another thing that I can do, and that is by using the actual class here. And instead of .all, we can use .set, and we can quite literally take an entire query set and pass that in and run that. That will also allow for me to set those permissions as well. So having that query set can be really, really nice. Now there's another thing is I can combine query sets too. So let's go ahead and use this perms QS, and then I'll go ahead and do my docs QS. And basically I'll say codename I contains, or maybe let's say ends with, and then we'll go ahead and do document. Okay, so now we've got our doc queues. Let's see what this looks like. There we go. So we've got can add document, can change document, can delete document, and so on. So great. Now I've got a new way to handle that permission as well, in which case I can actually combine these two, and we'll go ahead and just say new perms equals to docqs with a pipe. That's that straight up and down line. I can grab these perms here, and this is now a new query set with those combined, as you can see when we look at it, and in which case we could once again set those permissions for our user, and we could do it just like this. Great. And so now, of course, if I go into the Django admin, I can see now there's add and change, and I can do anything I would need with these documents. I can delete things, I can do all of that. And, you know, once again, even with this new perms, I can change it a little bit more and say something like new perms equals to that, filtering out, or let's say excluding the codename and I contains delete, right? So we have something in here for delete. Let's just make sure that delete is the value. So we've got in here can change, can delete, right? And so now let's go ahead and add that one. We just changed our permissions again. I refresh and now that delete method is gone. So this is cool. It's nice and powerful for this, but there's a big challenge with this that if we want to have any permissions outside of things that are already in Django, it starts to get really challenging. So for example, if you want to add in permissions for a specific API service that you want to be able to call for this user, it starts to get tricky because then you have to add it in as a model. You have to track things. It becomes a whole nother issue that we don't really want to have problems with in the future. So for now, I'm going to leave this as is though, and I want to do our proof of concept using just the Django permissions to do our actual AI requests with a lot of this data. We're now going to start the process of building out our AI agent with LangGraph and Django. If you go to LangGraph's documentation into their quick start, you will see this create agent step. It's actually pretty straightforward on how you do this. But the idea behind an agent is you get an LLM, whether it's OpenAI, Anthropic, or many of the other ones that are out there. You use that LLM to run functions for you. That's what AI agents do, and that's what this code is even showing us. We see that it's creating an agent based off of a model and a prompt, and then of course a list of tools. When you make a specific request, that agent will decide whether or not it should call one of those tool functions. In this case, it will call get weather from a given city. And this one right here says, what is the weather in SF? So the actual LLM will know we need to call this tool, this function here. So we want to build these, but we want to make them more complex than basically just returning back a string based off of this data. That's what we're going to start right now. So jumping into our local project here inside of SRC, I'm going to make a new folder called AI. Inside of this folder, we're going to go ahead and do an init file, and then we're going to go ahead and create tools.py. So in here, I want to define my very first tool, which is going to be just simply list documents. And then we're going to return back some document data. Where are the documents from? Well, of course, we are listing documents from our Django project, which would then be our actual Django database models. So what we do here is we say from our documents.models, we're going to import the document class here. We'll go ahead and do a query set, and we'll do document.objects.filter. We'll say active equals to true. Then we want to serialize this data. So the way we can do it is we'll go ahead and say our response data is equal to an empty list. Then we can iterate over the object itself, and then the query set itself, and then inside of the response data, we could just go ahead and append some serialized data like the ID itself, so obj.id, and then maybe the title and obj.title. So this process right here of serializing, you might use something different, something like Django REST framework or the Django Ninja, right? Or let's say you would do something like the Django model to dict function, or Django, or really even like something like Pydantic even, to turn this data into dictionary data, right? So there's a lot of different ways on how you can do that. This is a very manual way, so it's very clear as to what's going on, but we want to serialize our Django data into Python dicts or dictionaries. So that's the query set, that's doing the lookup. We can't return back a query set. We need to return back just basically raw data types. So this is the tool itself. And really this is going to be something like list a, or maybe get a user's recent documents, right? Something like that. Or maybe even better, get documents for the current user. Now, of course, we don't actually have our current user yet, so we'll have to come back to that. But the next one is going to be something like get document, and this will be our document ID, which will have a data type of integer. This is going to be very similar to what we have up here, but instead of it returning a list, it's going to return back just a dictionary itself, which would be something along those lines like that. And also, which would mean we are going to get that data, document ID equals to that document ID. But of course, the Django model itself just uses the field ID. This is kind of a hidden field that's in there, and then it would return back an object. So once again, we're serializing that data and just returning back either a list or a dictionary. In this case, it's going to be getting a specific document, get the details of a document for the current user, something along those lines. Great. So these are just standard functions. These aren't really ready for LangGraph. We want to make them ready. They're just not quite there yet. So we will do that in just a moment. But after we've got this one, let's go ahead and jump into our notebook and see how this works. So I'm going to go ahead and do for, and we'll just go ahead and do our LangGraph Django tool basics, something like that. Okay, and I'll delete all of these other ones in here. And all we're going to do is we are going to run our AI tools. So I'm going to go ahead and do from AI.tools. We're going to import everything. Actually, let's import the specific tool itself just to make it very explicit as to what we're doing so we don't accidentally do the wrong thing. Okay, so right now, to run these tools, we just run them like that. Not a big deal. Get document, we pass in the document ID can be equal to like 6, right? And that gives us that data. Not a big deal at all. So these results, though, we want to actually send to the actual LLM. We want it to be very similar to this right here. As it stands right now, these tools can't do that. We need to enrich them just a little bit. That enrichment is going to be changing them into a LangChain tool. And the way we do that is by just bringing in the tool decorator and doing this. Okay, so now that we've got this, we go back into our notebook here, we restart it, and we run it again. This time our list document is saying, hey, you can't do that. What you need to do now is invoke. The reason for this is we have now 2 options for invoke. This means that that function can either be synchronous with just invoke or asynchronous with invoke. And it also can be integrated in a lot of places, which we'll talk about soon. But if I just run invoke, it's still saying it's missing the input. In this case, we actually don't have any arguments to our function. It's just an empty function. So the input is going to be none. You just need to make sure that you're passing it when you're calling the function directly itself. When we do none, that's what we get. Now, if we do the same thing with the document and dot invoke, with that same argument, we get the incorrect value once again. That's because in here, we now want to pass it in as a dictionary for the actual key value pair that's going through. And I'll explain that in just a second. Okay, so we run that, and now it actually does. If we change it a little bit, we should see, a different document. Great. So the actual parameters here, these parameters, will be turned into basically a dictionary. So that's how we're going to pass it going forward. The LLM will understand that later, what it needs to pass to invoke each one of these things. But there's one thing that's missing from all of this, and that is the user ID. Now, on one hand, you might be like, oh, let me just pass in the user ID as argument. The reason we don't do this is partially security, and it's partially the session that you'll end up having when you actually create a chat or a graph with LangGraph. Before we even get there, though, I just pass in, the way we do it is by just saying config, and we can say user ID equals to some user. So in this case, I'll just use user ID of 2. This I can now pass in as another argument into this, and it's just another configuration item that I can now run. Oh, let's call it. And so all of them run, but they didn't change at all, right? If I change it to 1, let's change it to 1, still didn't change. So of course the tool itself needs to change. It needs to be aware of that user. So again, it's not an actual argument that comes in here like this. So user ID in here. That's not how it works. How it works is it becomes a runnable config. So from LangChain core.runnables, we import the class of runnable config. Now we can actually specify config in here as that data type in both places. And it's basically just after the arguments that you might need for your function itself. We can print out what this configuration is going to be to see what's happening with it. So if I were to run my notebook again, let's go ahead and restart it first and then run it. So it's flushed out. We can see the print statement. Now it's got tags, metadata, there's my user ID, callbacks, recursion, configurable. We've got all sorts of things that are going on with this function now that I can use. That configuration will be used in our entire graph. We will see that soon enough when we start building out our own agents. So this configuration right here also means that we can use it in our tool. So in other words, I can go ahead and say metadata equals to config.get metadata. Going back to that print statement, we can use metadata or configurable. Both of those things should work just fine. So I'll just go ahead and do config.get configurable. Then our user ID is going to be equal to whatever that metadata ends up being. We grab that user ID. And then we filter this by the owner ID equaling to that user ID. Now it's important to know that I don't actually have to get the owner object, right? So in the Django model, we have the owner foreign key here. I can also use owner ID, which is the user ID, to be able to filter things down like this. And so once I do that, I now have a user that's coming through that's ready for a graph. Now, the same concept is true down in this get document here. So we'd come down here, that get call would now be our owner ID being equal to that one. And then the other part about this is it will probably potentially run some errors, as in the document.does not exist. Then you would want to raise some sort of exception and say document not found, try again. And then the other exception being something in here as well, that you would then want to say something along the lines of invalid request for a document detail, try again, right? And so this exception here would tell the LLM you did something wrong. So that's an important part of it. But the other thing here is this get document. It's just going based off of the ID. If there is no user, there's a good chance that this will fail, which we could also say something along the lines, if user ID is none, then we can raise another exception if we wanted to in here as well, saying it's like invalid request for user, and do the same thing up there as well. But now that we've got that, we should be able to see the difference in here. So let's go ahead and restart our little notebook and we'll run this again and again. There we go. So now I'm looking for the user ID of 1. So in this case, I just got an invalid document for that user because of the configuration. So if I bring it back to a user that does have documents, or at least that one, I can now see here's all those values, and then I can actually run that document, and sure enough, there it is. Great. So now we have tools that are ready to be moved into an actual AI agent graph. It's not going to be a whole lot more than just what we've seen, which is pretty great. That makes it actually really straightforward, because this is also not a whole lot different than just standard Django itself. Now, the important part about this is really this runnable config here. What if we actually took away this decorator here? Would we still get that runnable config? The chances are probably not, right? So let's try that out. I'm going to remove that decorator and just try it out. And here we go. Function has no attribute invoke. So using that actual decorator and making sure that it is one of these tools gives us access to this runnable configuration that we can change no matter what. We can add a thread ID. So if you're making a chat document itself, like a chatbot of some kind that you can have multiple sessions of, you can put that thread ID in here as well, so you can keep track of those things also. It's a really effective way to do this, even though it feels like, hey, it should just be a simple function that passes in our user ID and stuff like that. This config is very valuable and very important in the long run of building out your LangGraph Django integration. We're now going to configure an LLM model for Django so that we can start building out our LangGraph agent. Now, for those of you who may have looked at the documentation for creating an AI agent, you will see that there is a way to just declare a model in here. Now, to me, this is a little bit too ambiguous to actually say, oh yeah, this is how I want to use it in my Django project, because it's just a string that has a provider and also the model that you might end up using. I don't see anything about the API key here. Now, I know just from using LangGraph that it's expecting an environment variable to inject that, but that's ambiguous to me here, which I think is something I want to move away from, especially when it comes to something as important as the LLM itself, right? And so just like our tool, we declared it as a tool a little bit differently than this function right here. We now want to declare our model in a very specific way. Now, this is not a fault of LangGraph. They're trying to make it as easy as possible to get an agent up and going. And I think this is really easy. But the idea here is we want to make it as like practical as possible and also easy to change later if we need to. Of course, you could go into the LangGraph documentation, look at the models that they have here, and you'll see a lot of different options on how you can do that. And you can see the specific OpenAI one. It's quite literally saying, hey, put in the OpenAI API key, which of course is something we'll end up doing. And then it has this init chat model, which also is still a little ambiguous as to what's going on. But we do see that this is requiring the LangChain OpenAI integration. The installation process here is a little bit different than the way we installed it. So let's actually take a look at the LangChain documentation. So we might change this a little bit as well. So going into LangChain, into integrations here, and then into OpenAI, we can see the OpenAI integration. This is still saying to install it here. Now we see, hey, go ahead and add it as an environment variable, and then we're going to go ahead and use this. And again, here's a usage example, and we can scroll on down to see various things for the usage and how we might go about doing it. So this is how we're going to be using the LLM. As you can see, we had to do a bunch of digging to get to this point. Personally, I don't love doing all that digging, but I think it's really important to know that we want to declare the LLM directly. I won't be changing it on the fly often, right? If I need to change it, I will do the same thing we're about to do and then just change the model accordingly. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump back into our project here, into the AI portion. We're going to go ahead and create LLMs.py. And then in here, I'm going to go ahead and do define get OpenAI model. And then I'll go ahead and pass in a model, a default model, which I'll just go ahead and use GPT-4o and dash mini. And that's going to be the model we'll end up using. Okay, so how do we actually get this model up and going? Well, first off, we can go back into the LangChain documentation, and here's exactly what it is that we're doing. So if I copy this whole thing and paste it in here, this is what we're actually going to be configuring now so that we can have this set up in a way that makes sense. Okay, there we go. Now, notice that we see that we can prefer to pass the API key directly instead of using environment variables. Now, in our case, we will still use environment variables, but we're going to pass it directly from the Django configuration. So with a few things here, we're going to change the model out like this. I'm not going to change these arguments, but of course you certainly can. Then we're going to go ahead and we'll leave our max retries at 2. Now we'll go ahead and put in our API key. Of course, there's other things you can do in here. So if you're using something like the Ollama, you could use the base import for Ollama for that base URL. So you could still use that chat OpenAI stuff in there as well, which is pretty nice that you have other parameters you can change in here. So where are we actually getting this API key from? Well, I'm going to go ahead and do from Django.conf import settings. And in here, this is where I'll go ahead and say settings.openAI API key. This is very Django-esque right here. We want this to be integrated with Django as an add-on feature to Django, so we're going to design it as such, right? If we were adding something different, if this was like a fast API application, this configuration would be slightly different to account for that. I want it to be very Django specific in this case. So that also means that I need this setting in here. So inside of my settings, I'll scroll on down and we're going to go ahead and use Python decouple in this case, which is going to go ahead and use the default API key, which is of course going to be none. Now I haven't put in Python decouple just yet, but I'll go ahead and do from decouple import config. Now you don't have to use Python decouple. You could change this to OS environ as well. So you could do something like os.environ.get. You could do that exact same thing if you like, or any other sort of environment variable loader. The configuration from a Django's perspective needs to be in settings.py, not in any individual element in there, which is exactly why we have it just like this. So with this in mind, I need to add in a .env file to run this one and to make it work. So that .env file we're going to put inside of the src folder, and we're going to go ahead and do .env just like that, and then we need an OpenAI key. For now, I'm just going to go ahead and say ABC because I want to make sure that that key is actually working. So I'm going to go ahead and print out the settings.openai API key here. Actually, I'll print them out not in there, but rather in the actual settings. Let's just go ahead and print this key right here, just to make sure that it is coming through when we go to run the server. So going back into our project here, let's save this, and notice it says ABC. The only reason for that was to make sure the .env was in the correct location. There's other places you could put it, like you could put it in the root of your project, but I'm going to leave it right here, and we'll also put .env.sample for the actual repo itself. Notice that this one's grayed out, where this one will not be. Okay, so the OpenAI key we want to grab now. Go ahead and log in to your OpenAI account, go to the platform itself, go into the dashboard, go to API keys, create a new secret key here. This one is going to be my AI agent LangGraph key, something like that. And I'm also going to go ahead and say dev, like as in dev mode. You can restrict it. I recommend restricting it to the project especially, but we'll go ahead and create this now. Copy this. We'll bring this one into our .env file here. We're going to go ahead and save that. And we're in, I think, pretty good shape to be able to start using this OpenAI model. Now, in some cases, what you also might consider doing is something like define get the OpenAI API key and then returning back that key itself. So in some cases, so if you have a bunch of models you want to store, you might actually store them in your database itself, in which case you would run this function to grab that. So like, for example, if you had an API key model and then you did objects.get, and then you would say something like provider equals to OpenAI, and then the model is something else, or the org is something else, in this case CFE, something like that. You could actually create models for that, and I've definitely done that before, which is why I might have this additional function to make sure I'm getting that data when I go into production as well, which means that it's not in the environment variables at all at .env. That would be stored in our database, which is something you may or may not want to do. There's a lot of things we could discuss about that, which I'm not going to have time to discuss right now. So with this in mind, I just want to verify that this whole thing works. So we're going to go ahead and create another notebook here. I'll copy the LangGraph one, and we're going to go ahead and do 5 and verify LLM, Django, something like that. We're going to go ahead and import Django, set this all up. Next up, we're going to go ahead and do from tools, AI tools, get LLMs. We're going to get the OpenAI model here, just like that. And then now we're going to go ahead and say our LLM or our model equals to get OpenAI model here. And let's go ahead and delete some of these things. There we go. And so now with this in mind, we could go ahead and invoke this model the same way we did with the tool, which in this case, we can just pass in a string itself and say something like, who are you? Run that, and we will see that this will actually run the AI message itself, which is great. So the model is now working. Now, of course, I see my OpenAI API key here, which I do not want. So let's go back into our settings, get rid of that print statement in there, because of course it's no longer there. And then we'll clear out the outputs, restart this, and we'll just go ahead and do that call all over again so that we can see the model is absolutely working, which is great. So this configuration is very Django specific, but the nice thing about it is the LLM itself, if for some reason LangChain is no longer the model that LangGraph uses, I don't know why that'd be the case, but if it was, we could just then change a few things in here to then later change out how our agent ends up working and all of that. So trying to be as forward thinking as possible when it comes to this kind of tooling. We're now going to create our AI agent using LangGraph and all of the configuration we've done so far. So let's go ahead and jump into our project under the AI. I'm going to go ahead and do agents.py. There's a really good chance that I'll have more than one agent. So for now, we'll just go ahead and stick with one. And so I'm going to go ahead and do from LangGraph.prebuilt. we're going to import the create React agent function. Now, I think it should just be called create agent. It often gets confused with React.js. This is not a React.js front-end agent of some kind. This is React, which is a type of AI agent. So that's what we're building right now. I'm going to define my own method called getAgent, and then we're going to go ahead and use that create React agent. Now, what you might remember is this is used in the quick start. If we scroll on down to the quick start, we can see exactly how it's used in here with this create React agent. So in this case, I'm actually going to call this my get document agent at some point. For now, I'll just leave it as get agent, so it keeps it kind of simple. But one of the things I really appreciate about LangGraph and LangChain, the team altogether, is how they actually approach handling these arguments. So if I were to copy their agent that they have here, and let's go ahead and just do that for now, and then hit return agent, what we'll see is this model here. You might think, oh man, do I have to actually type out open AI and then the model I was going to use here? Well, no, we can actually bring in our LLMs. So from AI.LLMs, we're going to go ahead and import our LLM name, which was just simply get OpenAI model. And then we can go ahead and say our model equals to that model there. And then I can just pass this in as argument. It is so cool that that works. It's not necessarily well documented right here, but the fact that it does work just shows this cohesiveness across these tools, even if it's not always clear all the time, because these tools do a lot. So it makes sense why they're also not clear. Okay, so now that we've got this, we just need our tools. What tools are we using? Well, inside of our tools here, we've got list documents and get documents. What I want to do is actually create a actual list down here, and we'll go ahead and say our document tools, and we'll set those equal to these tools in here. So I'm going to go ahead and add in list documents and also add in get document. Now, the key part of these functions is you probably could, not have the tool decorator in here, but you definitely need to have the doc string that explains this in as few words as possible. So what I want to do here is change this to list the most recent 5 documents for the current user, something along those lines, because we don't want to feed in the LLM way too much data. You could have thousands of documents. We don't want to have all of those come through. So it's just going to be literally 5. And I'm going to go ahead and cut this off to 5. Now, that's how you do it with a list. That's how you can do it in here. You could also just cut that off to being 5 right here. And if you really wanted to, you could even make a limit of some kind, like the limit of 5, in which case you would change the document here with any given argument that you might want to have. Now, with this in mind, I said most recent, I want to change the ordering. So we would do something like order by, the reverse of created at, which I often use created at or timestamp. The idea here is we want to make sure our model, whatever our model ends up being down here, we want to make sure that the auto now add one is the one we're going to use. So back into the actual tooling itself, we want to make sure we adjust that so that it reverses the order to have the most recent ones up front. And that is going to be our query set that's returned back to the AI model. So we now have our document tools that we'll use. So we're going to go ahead and save that, and we'll bring it into our agents here. And now I'll do from AI.tools, we're going to go ahead and import the document tools, and that's going to be the tools for this particular agent. You are a helpful assistant in managing a user's documents within this app. Something like that. That's it. Of course, you could have a much more robust prompt than that, but I'm just going to do a very simple one. This prompt also goes in line with the tools themselves. So when we actually run this, the model itself will be injected with these tools, and you'll be able to actually have access to them, which we of course want to test in just a moment. But that's going to be the agent. That's very straightforward and hopefully as simple as it can be. Now, the idea here is the tools themselves. We don't want to have too many tools. In this case, you can have a lot of different agents for all of your resources, and then you could have a multi-agent tool, which we'll look at very soon, to be able to coordinate all of those agents. So basically, the goal here is to not have very many tools, to have maybe 10, 20 at the most. Now, there are a lot of discussions you can have about the different tools. I'm only going to have 4 for this agent, which I recommend you do the same. You can always create more agents, which is something we definitely want to see. Okay, let's go ahead and test this out. And now I'm going to go ahead and do hello world AI agent, something like that. There we go. And so now we'll go ahead and run this one. This, of course, is going to be from AI import agents. And this is going to just be simply get agent. And I'll say as get document agent because we'll probably change it. And we should probably just do that right now if we're going to import it a little bit different. So let's go ahead and just do that. There we go. Okay. So here we go. And now I've got my agent in here, and this is going to be get AI agent. And then we will go ahead and do some stuff to the agent itself. Not quite this. We still have to modify that. So let's go ahead and restart this. And we'll go ahead and make sure we can at least get the agent itself. So how we invoke this is usually not with a question like this, right? You couldn't get an error. It expected a dictionary, not just a string. So the dictionary it's expecting is messages and then a list of messages that you would put in here. So there's ways to store all of your old data. So there's a lot of things that we could talk about in terms of how we end up doing this. But the idea here is the message itself is going to have a role of user. And then inside of there, the actual content will be in there of the actual thing that we're trying to list out here. So who are you is not great for this one. Instead, we want to say something like, what are my recent documents? Now, before I actually run this, there's a key part that we are also missing for this invoking that we have. One of them is the actual syntax being correct, which is why I'm separating these things out just a little bit so we can see exactly what's going on with the message. The other one being the configuration. So what we want to do here is we want to add in a config item in here. And in this case, we're going to go ahead and do something called configurable. This is now going to have another dictionary, which is going to be our user ID. And we want to grab one, which I think 2 was the one we'll use. And then after the messages, we pass in that configuration. Notice it's slightly different than what we did with the tools themselves, which was config user ID of 2, which I actually want to update my tools just slightly to use configurable as the default. So I'll come in here and change the ordering of my tools for that because of what we want for this, right? And so I'll call this configurable now and configurable. There we go. And then I'll go ahead and repeat this process down here for my get documents. Okay. So this is because of the actual, element itself. We can actually pass in something else in here called thread ID, and we pass in something like uuid.uuid4, and then I'll go ahead and import that. Import uuid. Okay. So now we've got a way to keep those configurations the same, but I'll go ahead and now run it with our user ID and our thread. If I did everything correctly, it should work. Now, in the case of this one, the reason it worked was twofold. One, of course, we configured everything right here, and we can see that here are my recent documents that just says title, title, title. Not great documents, but it is showing those recent documents in there. So we can take a look at those messages very soon, but it did respond with something. One of the things I didn't do, though, is restart the actual notebook where it's actually using this configurable. So in this case, it actually just went off of the previous fallback that I had. So this metadata should still work, but we just wanted to change it a little bit to work with the AI agent in the way that the documentation says, which we can actually take a look at the documentation for this, which I think it's in here somewhere with the configurable. There it is right there. Okay. And so there's this memory thing where you also might want to add in, which is the memory itself. So you can have a long running configuring thread in here that you might end up using, which we'll take a look at later. But for now, we can actually see this. So if I go ahead and say the response from that AI agent, run that again, I can see the response messages themselves. So let's take a look at that response. We've got messages in here. Hey, what do you know? Messages and messages. Okay. So now we've got all of the messages. So for MSG in that response, I can print out the msg.content, and we should be able to see all of the messages that are coming through. So we see my first one, what are my recent documents? The second one, the actual system message, the tool message is that data, and then the final, or rather this data, and then the final message is this one right here. We can really see this if we enumerate it. So if we go ahead and say enumerate, we can take a look at these messages as well, and we can see, kind of what position of these messages there are, and then we'll go ahead and print out like a few new lines each iteration, and there we go. So we see here's the first one. There's no message in the actual iteration for the second, but then the actual message response, the actual data comes through, and there's our recent documents. Great. So quite literally working now by calling our actual API tools in there, which is, I think, fantastic. Of course, you could always look at more things related to the message itself if you want to. So if you scroll on over, you can see all of the data that's coming through in here, response metadata, right? So we've got our content, our data all together. With this one, it has no content. So really, we would probably say something along the lines, if MSG content, then we would see what that content might be. And then we'd be able to stream out all of this different data. Of course, if you actually want the response itself, you could always just grab that last item that's in there. So in the messages, you do -1.content. This should give you that final message that would be coming through in here. And of course, it is formatted with Markdown. Pretty neat that this works so seamlessly. And of course, now it's just a matter of building out additional tooling that we might want to have for this data for managing our documents. I created a new notebook in here mostly so that we can add in a check pointer for memory. So this new notebook has our original question of what are the documents. It will see the response there, and then questioning if there's duplicates based off of those documents, which we already know there should be. So if I come in here and run this, what we'll end up seeing are the most recent documents. There they are, just like that. And then we can say, are there duplicates? And in which case, it will either say yes or no, right? So right now there is seemingly memory in there, as in it's remembering what's going on. And I suspect it has something to do with this thread ID here. So let's go ahead and actually get rid of that thread ID, and we'll just go ahead and run it again. And more than likely, it'll either say the same thing or it will say something different. So what we got here is the same thing. So it seems to have some sort of persistent memory as default, right? That's not very clear in the documentation that I could tell. So what I want to do though is be deliberate about memory and add in a check pointer, in this case, an in-memory saver. And so now I'm going to just make sure that it is for sure going to have memory by passing it into the agent itself, just like that. So inside of the agent, then I will go ahead and add in check pointer being none, and then we'll pass that into our create React agent, just like that. Now, this is a shortcutter, so maybe it already has some defaults in there for the actual agent itself, which I'm not able to look up for whatever reason. But the idea here is the actual code should actually now work a little bit better for the check pointer, and then we could have other kinds of memory. Like, so if you wanted a Redis check pointer, for example, I think it's called a Redis memory saver. That is something that you could then do. Now, in the long run, you might also want to store this in as Django models or store the actual chats somewhere, which could also be in Redis. But the idea being that we now have some memory set in, so it's going to be maybe a little bit easier for the agent to recall this data a little bit more quickly too. And so the memory also, I think, helps reduce the number of requests that you're doing to any sort of LLM. That's why that one goes a little bit faster in this case. So in this, it's also saying, are there duplicates? It says the title appears 3 times, where it actually appears 4 times. So 1, 2, 3, and we've got 4, right? So we've got the exact same title as the title 4 times, where it's only counting 3. So perhaps this actual model is not great at counting. So if we go into the LLM, maybe GPT-4o mini is just not great at counting. So let's go ahead and try GPT-4o, and let's see if that does anything in terms of a difference, which of course we could always pass in that same model to the agent itself, the model string itself, and see if that does anything different. And now it says there are duplicate titles, and now it says 4. The model made a difference, and it says unique ID has only one. Okay, cool. That's great. So it's nice to see that that part is working and it's giving us a bit better of a result. So with this in mind, I want to then go ahead and say, let's go ahead and change the agent itself and do model being none. In the AI agent model, we'll also go ahead and pass that one in. This probably is going to just change to being LLM model so that it's not conflicting with the new variable in here. And then back into our LLMs, this is now that model. And we'll go ahead and say if model is none, then the model equals to GTP 4.0 and many, or whatever model's out for you at this point. There we go. And so that way we have a fallback model basically in there. Otherwise it'll run some errors, which is totally fine as well. And then now we've got that in here. So then going back into our agent, we can then now pass in that model in there as well. So GPT-4.0 like that. Great. So there we go. And now once again, let's go ahead and save everything in these files. We'll restart and run all, and then just giving us a little bit more of configuration ourselves on our own agent. Now I realize that this is starting to then look like the exact same thing as this create React agent, which you definitely might consider just using that directly and making those changes instead of what I did here, because then you could just call the model directly. So it's kind of up to you on how you go about doing that. The reason I like doing something like this is because then I can set the prompts here and make those kind of like standardized prompts that I use for that specific agent and not necessarily having to have it everywhere, right? And also having some defaults in there as well, like we just saw with our LLM itself. Let's go ahead and add in some other operation into our tools so that we can do CRUD, or create, retrieve, update, and delete. Right now we have retrieve as in list and get. Let's go ahead and now do the other parts of CRUD. So the very first one will be a new tool that we'll just go ahead and say create document, right? And so this time, instead of document ID, we would say something like document title, or just simply title, which will be a string, and then the content itself, which will also be a string in there, just like that. So now we're going to go ahead and say create a new document based on the arguments, title, string max characters of, let's say, 120, and then content, long form text in many paragraphs or pages. Something like that. Just adding in, we'll go ahead and say arguments are. Something along these lines. Now, we could probably improve this docstring in general, create a new document to store for the user, something like that. There we go. So now we've got our user ID still in there, document.objects.create, and this, of course, is going to be based off of what we've got for our title. So title, and then we've got our owner ID in there, and then our content being content. Okay, and so go ahead and copy this, and we'll go ahead and paste that in just like that. We do not have an exception necessarily with this because we don't have any real strong things about our documents. So if we look at our documents here, there's no uniqueness inside of title or content. We've already seen that with our default in there, but now we don't need to enforce any uniqueness at this point. Okay, so now we've got our response. This time I'm going to go ahead and say content in, that's obj.content, and then I'll go ahead and do created at, and that's obj.created at, right? And so this same sort of response data probably makes a lot of sense for the detail here. This is where serializing that data would be much better than what we're doing here, but I'm trying to keep things as simple as possible. Okay, so that's creating our document. I'm going to go ahead and now add it as a tool. And since we created this document tool here, now our agent already has the ability to do that. So let's go ahead and clear everything out on our new little CRUD here. And I'm going to go ahead and activate it. We still have our memory in there. We don't necessarily need to add that memory in this case. But now I'm going to go ahead and say, give me a summary of the movie Mission Impossible 1. I'm going to run that. And this should actually do some sort of guess as to what that summary is. It's a pretty old movie, so no big deal here. Great. So now with that in mind, we'll go ahead and say, great, Now save it to my documents, something like that. And let's see what happens here. After that runs, I'm going to go ahead and say list, or what are my recent documents. All right, so it says, here's a summary. There it is. We add another question here. What are my recent documents? And this is now your recent document entitled. There we go. Let's go ahead and say recent, let's say 3 documents or something like that. This might be now a good idea to have an argument in here. So it says you only have 1 document, which is interesting. So let's go ahead and see what my user is. I changed the user ID in here too. So that's pretty interesting. Okay, so now let's go ahead and do it again and say the movie summary of Mission Impossible 2. Run that, and then great, now save it to my documents. We'll run that after, and then what are my recent documents in here? We'll go ahead and run that. And once again, it should give me all of this stuff. So Mission Impossible 2, here's a nice little description of that. Probably, I don't know. Then it saves it. And then the next one being, here are your recent documents, Mission Impossible 2, Mission Impossible 1. Okay, let's change this movie to, let's say, Lord of the Rings trilogy. Run that, save it, and then what are my recent ones? And so once again, it's going to do the same sort of idea. Not quite sure if it's going to be perfect here. That's not really the point. The point of this is to be able to do CRUD with an AI agent, knowing that we can tell it what arguments we want for the data, right? Title and content makes a whole lot of sense. And then of course we can always query those things in just a moment as well, directly in the database itself. So Lord of the Rings trilogy movie summary, it's not all 3 movies because we didn't specify that, right? It just has those 3 data points right there. So now we can actually just do a quick search inside of the Django shell. So let's go ahead and take a look inside of our project here. We'll do Python manage.py shell, and then we'll do user ID being 3, and we'll go ahead and do document.objects.filter, the owner ID equals to the user ID, and there we go. So we've got our documents in here. There's our Lord of the Rings trilogy. Let's go ahead and do the last one and then the content of it, and there we go. So pretty cool that we can just have a quick little chat and it'll store it into our Django project, of course. So naturally, what we could do then from here is, let's say this Git document, I can copy that tool and come underneath and then just do something like delete document, right? So delete the document for the current user by document ID. Same sort of thing, we get our object in here, and then I'm going to go ahead and just say obj.delete down here, and then we'll go ahead and give our response data, and we'll go ahead and say message, and we'll go ahead and say success, or something along those lines for the response itself, or we can just say true. There's a lot of different ways on how we can think about that. So we've got create, and then I can just come here and paste that in. And then from create, I'm going to go ahead and copy this, paste in here, and say update document. Now we're going to have something very similar to the get or create one, this right here. I'll go ahead and copy that. We are going to go back into update now. So instead of that being the object, we'll save it like this, right? And so we need document ID to be an argument in here now, and we'll say int. We'll go ahead and pass in this argument, and we'll go ahead and say ID of document required. And then the content, I'll go ahead and say, or the title is none, the content is none. And we'll go ahead and say optional and optional. Okay. The runnable config here is, well, right now we have nothing in there. I'm going to go ahead and set it equal to none as well. See if that ends up working for us. It might not, but nevertheless, we've got our title in here. And now I'll go ahead and say if title is not none, then obj.title equals to title. And then if content is not none, obj.content is content. And then if title or content, then we'll go ahead and say obj.save, something like that. Okay, so that will save that data and then respond back with it. So update a document, update a document for a user by the document ID and related arguments. Great. So now that we've got that, let's go ahead and come back into our app here. I'm going to restart this. And this time I'm just going to go ahead and invoke right above here and say, update the Lord of the Rings trilogy document title to just LOR, like that, summary. Let's see if this works. This may or may not do it, right? Oh, we need to run this. The reason it's still a little vague, right? So I'm hoping what it'll do is call the list to look for Lord of the Rings, then call the update after that. So it might work, it might not. It looks like it did. This is gonna be wild if it did, and it was that easy. Okay, let's try that again. We've got content, same content. Let's try title. And there we are. Amazing. AI is so cool. So it already knew. It's going to look at all of its tools. It's going to see what tools are available, and then it's going to go off of that. So we could even do this even better. Instead of just list documents, we could have something along the lines of search documents. And this is where we might have or let's go ahead and do search. Let's call this actually query documents or search query of documents. That way we can pass in the query here, and there's going to be an str. And so now what we would want is, let's put a comma here. We'd want to use this query inside of here. So definitely going to be based off of that user and whether or not it's active. The next query would be something a little bit different. So what I would do here is just say lookups, and then we would say our owner ID is equal to the user ID, and then active being true. Then we'll go ahead and give the query itself. So the query itself is going to be based off of what we want. So we could do a couple different kinds of lookups, but I'll just go ahead and do a title with that query, or we'll go ahead and do title I contains query, right? And so this is now going to be our lookups in here, and I'll do something like that. So if we wanted to have a little bit more advanced lookups in here, we would go from Django.db.models. We would import the Q lookup. And so we would have our default lookups, which is what this will be. So default lookups. Then I can use those defaults. And then we can then do another filter in here, which would do the Q lookups, which we would use a pipe to have both of them. The Q lookups, this gives me either or, the either being title I contains that query, or the content I contains that query. And this gives us a much better search the most recent 5 documents. Let's go ahead and put a limit here, and we'll do an int equaling to 5, config again being equal to none. Okay, and there we go. This probably would be better off with a dictionary value for both of them based off of what we actually end up looking up. So let's go scroll on down to this one down here. So there's not errors related to these arguments right above. Okay, so there we go. So now we've got our search query as well. So search for the most recent, limit documents for user, arguments, query, string, or lookup search across title or content of document. And then the limit number of results. And so now that we've got this, we might as well do that same thing with our list document here, and we'll put that down here as well. So once again, we'll go ahead and do limit is an integer, the default being 5. The configuration default is going to be empty. And then we go ahead and say arguments, and here we get rid of that, and boom. Now we have the ability to have a lot more. I would actually probably say something like max results in here, like there's like not even going to be an argument for it, but let's say the most recent limit documents with a maximum of like, I don't know, 25, let's say. And so basically, if the limit is greater than the 25, then the limit is 25, something like that. Just to make sure we're not overloading all of this stuff. Okay, and number of results with a maximum of 25. Okay, and there we go. Cool. So now we've got pretty robust CRUD tools for our agent in here that we could do all sorts of things that we see fit. So let's go ahead and just try out the delete one, and we'll go ahead and say remove the mission impossible to summary. And hopefully that will actually do it. It'll actually remove it. Has been successfully removed. If you need anything else, let me know. Great. If I try it again, it just gives me the same result. Fantastic. Cool. So we now have an unprecedented amount of power for these AI agents. So perhaps we want to change that a little bit, and I recommend that we do. But overall, using an agent for CRUD in this way is very straightforward. You may or may not have to say save in here, like you could use that as a prompt inside of the agent itself. So if we go back into these agents, and so you would say something like if the document needs to be added or updated in the database, do so. This might be something you want to have as the prompt, maybe not. It's worth testing though. I don't know how reliable that part would necessarily be, but it is something that's cool that you could try out in terms of CRUD in this way. We're now going to create an AI agent that uses an API, a third-party RESTful API service. In this case, it's going to be the movie database. Now, the idea here is you're going to create a simple API client, then you're going to turn that client into a tool that can then make calls to this API service through your AI agent. So it's very similar to what you would do to automate this yourself, but it's one step further by just creating a little tool that the AI agent ends up using, which is what we're going to do right now. So first and foremost, we want to get the movie database API key. The way you do that is, of course, signing up for a free account on the movie database and then going into the API documentation reference and then grabbing a token here. Now you can probably also go into your account directly and grab one there as well. I believe that's possible, but I'm just going to go based off of their documentation. Their documentation is fantastic. It's really easy to get a lot of proof of concept here going. Now, one of that also relies on an API key set up correctly. So here we go. I've got it in my .env. I also added it into the sample. As soon as I add something to .env, I typically go directly into Django settings and add it in there as well, which I'm going to do right below my OpenAI key, just like that. Great. So now that we've got this, I want to start building out my own API client that is just purely Python, and it's basically a manual way for me to call this API itself. So inside of the SRC folder here, I'm going to go ahead and create tmdb. Inside of there, we're going to go ahead and make an init file, and then I'll go ahead and create a client file as well. So what is it that I want to do? Well, first and foremost, I want to be able to search for movies. So if we do this jump to and type out movie, you can see all sorts of things related to a movie that's in here, as well as this search element. If I click on that, what it's going to show me is it's going to show me a sample request here and sample query parameters. So if I said something like mission impossible and did a search for that, go ahead and hit try it, it will give me some sort of result back in here, right? And so the important thing about this response is it is, well, 4 items coming back with maybe a certain number of pages and all that. So that's an important part that we will look at in the very near future. For now, I'm going to go ahead and copy out this code that it gives us as an example. I'm going to paste this in. Now let's remember, this code is for searching the movie. So I can just create a new function here called search movie. And then I want to pass in all of the different arguments I want to support with this client. Query, include adult content, language, primary release year, page, region, so on, right? Year. So I'm just going to have query in here as a string, and maybe I'll support pagination, maybe not, but I'll put a default in there as page of 1. So these are the 2 parameters that I definitely want to have. So that's going to be query, and then page and page. So those are arguments that I'll end up using that will be converted into the API request parameters. So the next one is going to be include adult. I'm going to make this not a parameter that I can do in the function itself. I'll just hard code it as being false, always false in this case. Next is going to be our language. This could be another parameter as well, but in our case, I just want to do the EN US, or the English for US. And those are the main parameters that I want to have. Now, in order to turn these into URL parameters, just like the example up here, we can use Python request for that. So all I need to do is return back, let's say, for instance, our response equals to request.get URL headers equal to headers, and then params equals to params, right? That's all I need to do is pass in that parameters. But I also need a plain URL that does not have any parameters. The nice thing about that is back in the documentation, here's the URL we are actually calling. So I could just go ahead and say that URL. Now, once again, these actual API requests are very, very straightforward because of how this is playing out. But this is a common way to do RESTful API requests. The nice thing is we have an API key that will allow for us to actually make these calls. If you're trying to do something like Google Sheets, that requires something called OAuth2, which is not the same thing as this API key. That requires a whole nother section, which you would need to use something like Clerk as a managed service, or something like the Django OAuth package itself if you want open source. So I've been leaning towards more managed packages, but the idea here is if you need another kind of API service, that it will probably require OAuth2. A lot of them do, for good reason. It is better security. But now that we've got this, we have this idea in mind of our simple search here, and then all I really want to do is return back response.json in here, which would be the actual response. You could also do something like raw being true or false, and then basically saying if raw, then you return back the actual Python request response, which is totally fine as well. One more thing I want to do is the headers here, is I want to actually make these a function. So we're going to go ahead and define get headers, and this will just return back basically this same data with a major change, and that is getting rid of this API key being hard-coded in here. You never want to do that ever. So get rid of it. Then where did we place it? Well, you might remember from Django.conf, import settings. The actual setting is going to be in here. So we'll go ahead and put an F string here and put in settings dot. And I believe we did tmdb API key. We could verify that by going into our settings. Let's go in there, and there it is. There's our API key right there. So let's go ahead and copy that, and yeah, same one. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and put our headers down here by getting those headers. Now, those of you who know how to design API clients yourself, you would probably not have these all as functions. Totally get that. I'm just doing it as functions to make them as simple as possible here. Now, again, this is just the API client. We have nothing to do with AI just yet. We have not created anything for our agent yet. But I do want to support another maybe endpoint in here as I see fit. So what would be another endpoint? Well, that will be something like movie detail. And the movie detail itself takes in something for a movie ID, which is going to be an integer. And we'll get rid of the page number in there. Everything else we do need to change a little bit, which let's go ahead and see what we need to change them to. So back into the movie database documentation, we'll do another search for movie. And then I really want to see the movie detail. So looking through here, search is not it. You know, we've got all this stuff. So I'm not seeing the detail in here. So I'm going to just go ahead and search detail. Now I see a bunch of things related to details. And there we go, movie details. So now I've got the API endpoint. Here's the URL that I need to use. Let me see here. Let me grab that one. So this is going to be our URL. I'll just go ahead and paste that in. Hey, what do you know? It already has it ready for string substitution. So I just need to put an F there. And now I've got a new URL. And so if we look for any parameters, I don't see that many parameters. I just see language and append a response. So I don't need page or query, in other words. I probably could just keep them in there, and I'm sure the API would just ignore it. But everything else is basically the same, right? And so, of course, we could also get other API endpoints in here as we see fit. I'm just going to do these two right here. And this is my API client now, right? So before we even start using the AI stuff, I'm going to go ahead and create something, go 9 API client tests, or let's go ahead and say the TMDB API client, and I'll just get rid of tests in there. And then we'll go ahead and set this up, and let's go ahead and import. So we'll go ahead and just simply do from TMDB, import client as TMDB client, something like that. That's importing the client module. then we should be able to do TMDB client and search movie, and we'll go ahead and say Mission Impossible, hit enter, and if we did it correctly, we should get a result here. There we go, okay? And so this is giving me all of the results as we see, so if I wanted to get specific things, we will see that. So let's go ahead and say response equals to that, and then I'll go ahead and do the results equals to the response.get results, and now I can actually see what the results are. And of course, it's a list of items here, so if I grab the very first one, the 0th element, I should get the most recent response here, which is going to be Mission Impossible Final Reckoning, which of course just came out for those of you who are in 2025 still. And then you can go ahead and get the ID here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So let's get the actual ID, and we'll just go ahead and say movie ID equals to that. There we go. And then I can go ahead and grab from that movie ID. I can do the next one. Let's get rid of these in here. The next one, as in the detail response equaling to TMDB client dot movie detail of that movie ID. And then now we can take a look at what that response is. And there we go. So we've got a lot more data in here about this project or this movie in particular based off of these API requests. Great. So now we have this API client. It's time to turn it into tools that we can use in an AI agent, which is going to be very straightforward based off of this client and everything we've done so far. We're now going to create our movie discovery agent is what I'm going to call it. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new function for it. And we're going to go ahead and call this get movie discovery agent, something like that. So this leads me to, oh, now I need to get the tools associated to this agent. So now I'm going to go ahead and create a new module inside of AI called tools. And then we'll go ahead and do init.py here. And then I'm going to go ahead and create two new modules actually. So discovery, we'll go ahead and do movie discovery.py. And then I'll also go ahead and create my documents.py, right? And so documents.py is going to be our original tools module here. And then inside of the init method here, I'll just go ahead and bring that single list in there. And then I'll go ahead and put that as sort of an export for that single list. As soon as I do that, this old tools, I can delete it. I'm just gonna move it to trash, and there we go. Okay, so now we want our movie discovery tools in here. So I'm gonna go ahead and call these movie discovery tools, and we'll go ahead and put that in as an empty list. And once again, in my tools here, I'll go ahead and bring that in, .movie discovery, import those tools, and let's not get the typos going. And then we'll go ahead and add this one in as well. Okay, and so now I'll go ahead and bring that into my AI agents, and we'll import that just like that. And then here we go. So now we've got our movie discovery agent with an empty list of tools, but tools nonetheless. And we can go ahead and say you are a helpful agent or a helpful assistant in finding and discovering information about movies. That's it. So it's quite a bit different than our other agents, but it is an agent nonetheless. So really the question then becomes, what tools do we want? Well, going back into our document tools, we have a search query tool at the very beginning. So once again, I'll do something very similar. I do not want to import the documents anymore or Django stuff really at all. I'm going to go ahead and now do search query movies or search movies, something like that. So I could just go ahead and say search movies, and that's it. So search the most recent movies, something along those lines, and then we'll do the necessary requests in here. So what are the necessary requests? So the query is going to be one of them. Limit will probably be one of them as well. So the necessary requests are going to be similar to what we did with our API agent documentation. So we have to bring in the actual client itself. So we bring in that client. Then we have to bring in the search response in here. So here is going to be our search. And now we've got that. And then I just want to return back our results. I don't want to get the movie ID at this point, but I will return back my results. So if you recall, the results are going to be a list. I definitely want to have this query in here like that. So there's going to be our search into the actual lookup. And that search will give us some response back. Let's go ahead and just do that quick search again in here. And I'll type out movie. We're going to go ahead and do a search. And then I'll go ahead and say Lord of the rings this time, and then hit try it. That gives us a result back, which gives us a few different parameters for that result response. So going back into our tool here, this is that response. It's going to have those items in there, those 4 items. So total results in here is going to be really what we want to look for. And that's going to be total results equals to response.get results, or total results. Okay, great. So basically what I want to do is I want to make sure that this is an integer. So I'm going to go ahead and do try block here, and we're going to go ahead and say int of that value. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and say the total results is equal to like 0, which I don't think is going to be correct, but the way we're going to use it will be fine. Okay. The way we're going to use it is basically saying something along the lines of if total results is greater than limit, then we'll go ahead and update the limit till maybe 10. So like doubling the limit. Let's go ahead and say limit times 2, right? Maybe not even 2, I don't know. But the point is we want to double it or change what that limit might be. I'll just leave it as 10 because the limit's going to default to 5. Okay. Now, important part about this too is the way I'm designing this is identical to the way I designed it before. Now, the reason I think this is important is so that the AI agents have very consistent patterns when they go and use any given tools. I think this will become more and more important as you start to have a ton of tools. Now, it's not always going to be possible, but in this case, it definitely is. Okay, so with that in mind, I then come in here to the results and bring it up to what that limit's going to be. And that's kind of the point. And those are the ones I return then. So maximum of 5 results. So the configuration in this case, we don't really need to do anything unless we want to check the user themselves. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in that value in here because maybe I want to do some user checks. Maybe they don't have access to use this API yet. So there we go. So now what we want to do is search the most recent limit movies from the movie database with a maximum of, oh, we can use 25 again, which I think is what we did with documents. Yeah, there we go. So let's go ahead and just say that. So if limit is greater than 25, even better, right? If total results is 0, then maybe we want to do something different. So let's change this to -1. So if total results equals to 0, then we'll just return back an empty list. These are results. Great. Okay, so now I have a way to search these movies. And of course, I do not have a way yet to say searching with user, something like that. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. And then of course, our detail is going to be movie detail. And we'll go ahead and say movie detail from the IMDb movie database if it exists, or the movie database, not IMDb. And then we just pass in movie ID here. And this is going to be an integer. We do not need a limit at all. But I've got everything else. This time it's not going to be search movie, but rather movie detail of that movie ID. Arguments, movie ID, integer, or let's go ahead and say, yeah, we'll do integer from a movie search, or something like that. That's probably fine. Okay, and then we get our response. What is our response going to be? It's just a dictionary, so I can get rid of the limit and all that stuff. So I can just return back the response data. Once again, I'll go ahead and now say raw being false, just to make sure that we are not getting raw data ever, unless we want that raw data. One of the reasons you might want the raw data coming back is basically saying something along the lines, if not response dot status code in range, like say 200 and 299, or not in range rather, should be if response not in range. Then we return back an empty list as well, or maybe raise an exception. That's when you would want it to be raw. That's about it. Okay, so now that we've got that, we've got a couple new tools. We've got search movies, and then movie detail. Great. So now, of course, we want to try this out. So I'm going to go ahead and grab agent CRUD, or rather memory agent. Let's just copy this one and we'll go 10, and this will be the movie discovery AI agent. Okay, we're going to init, and then now it's going to be get discovery movie discovery agent. There we go. We still want that memory. We want to now go ahead and use that discovery agent. I don't think I need to pass in this model, but I will leave it for now because it's a little bit more powerful than the previous one. And so there's our thread here. And I'll go ahead and say, tell me about the first Lord of the Rings movie. Something like that. I'm going to run that response. The search itself, notice it's showing search, which is pretty cool. I'm going to go ahead and delete some things. And then I also want to, this is also showing me that the tool is actually being run, but I actually just want to verify that by doing -2 here for the messages. And it says tool message, and here is the tool message itself, Lord of the Rings collection, which is interesting. It's not necessarily the movie itself, but then we get a content, and there's a response. So that's probably why we got 2 searches in there, is because it didn't necessarily go for the movie itself. But there we go. The Lord of the Rings is the first film, and then it gives us the release date and all of that. Great. So we now have a way to call an API service based off of these simple tools. Now, a big part of this as well that's important to understand is that we unpacked what the API request did in advance. And so having the user, maybe we only want to allow the user to call this 3 times in an hour. So there's permissions that we probably want to put in, maybe not even based off of a number, maybe just based off of their role. But the other thing is we could then also modify these results because we know what API is coming through, right? So if I wanted to remove things from the results, in other words, serialize these differently, I can at this point, right? So if we go back into that search and we can take a look at what data is coming back inside of the search itself, maybe I only want to show the original title, the overview, and popularity. Maybe it's just those 3 values in there, and possibly the vote count and average and stuff too. Maybe those are the only things I want to show in these responses, right? And in which case, I would then have less data for the LLM to work off of, but very specific data that I want to, parse things out of, which is pretty cool. So at this point, we now have another AI agent. So really the question is, how do we combine the two? Let's create a supervisor agent. LangGraph makes this very straightforward. The supervisor agent can work with all of these different agents. So a big part of the reason why our tools can be limited is because of these supervisor agents, right? So we have our documents tools that are corresponding to our document agent. We have our get movie discovery agent that corresponds to those tools as well. And again, those are very, very limited. So now what we're going to do is jump into our AI and we're going to go ahead and create supervisors.py. And so these supervisors are going to basically be integrated with the agents, similar to how the agents were integrated with the tools. And so what we want to do is make sure that we actually have the ability to use these supervisors. So we'll go ahead and install that package as well. So we'll go ahead and come in here and we'll just do our LangGraph supervisor. And then let's go ahead and run our pip install -r requirements.txt. Just like that, that should bring that in for us. Now, I do imagine that this is going to change over time. So I'm going to go off of their documentation. I'm going to literally copy their documentation and paste it in and then just modify it to fit with what we need, right? And so let's go ahead and paste that in, and there we go. So first and foremost, we see a couple tools here. We don't need those tools. We see a couple agents here. We don't need those agents. We just see the supervisor. So now we're going to go ahead and do that define get supervisor. And it's going to be basically this same sort of concept, but we'll go ahead and just return that value and we'll grab those agents in just a little bit. I'll get rid of the responses because we don't have those just yet. We'll play around with that in a moment. And then I'll get rid of this pre-built here, just like that. Okay. I also don't need the chat OpenAI stuff in here either, because just like our agents, we can actually bring that in, which is going to be exactly what we do. So back into our supervisor here, I'll go ahead and do our model being none, and then we'll go ahead and do from ai.llms. We're going to import our get OpenAI model, and then our LLM model will be that exact same thing, right? So again, same exact as the agent itself. We can also pass in the check pointer in here, most likely. So we'll go ahead and try that out as well, which will be down inside of this. So we'll go ahead and pass in that check pointer. So if we take a look in here, there's probably a check pointer in here. Maybe, maybe not. We'll just go ahead and try it, see if there's an error. If there's not, the check pointer actually might go in here, come to think of it, based off of that compile, which we'll see as well. Next up, we're going to go ahead and do from AI.agents. We're going to now import our various agents. Or better yet, I'm going to go ahead and do from AI import agents, and then just go ahead and pass in the different agents I want to use on this particular one. So agents dot, and this is going to be our get document agent, and then agents dot get discovery agent. And we want to initialize them, I believe, which is what's happening right here. These are being initialized. We're doing the same thing right here. Great. So there is our agents, and our model needs to be passed in right here. And there we go. You manage a hotel booking assistant and a flight booking assistant. You manage a document management assistant and a movie discovery assistant. Assign work to them. Great. Seems fairly straightforward. Next up, we're going to go ahead and copy our AI movie agent one again. And now I'll go ahead and do multi-agent supervisor. And there we go. So we'll go ahead and bring this one in here. And now from supervisors, import get supervisor. And we'll keep in that LangChain there. This time we can leave it in as agent. We can probably leave it called as that, but I think they call it a supervisor. So we'll just stick with their naming of it because it is a supervisor. It's not the same thing as an agent. It is very similar, just not the same. Okay. And so next what we see here is there's a way to stream it. This is streaming responses, which what we're not doing. We want to do invoke as well. That's another way to call it. You can call stream, you can call invoke, and you do the same configuration in there all across the board. Great. And now I can go ahead and say, what are my recent documents? Okay, let's make sure that all of this is defined. So let's go ahead and run it all and see if we get any issues. Looks like we do have an issue. Okay, so please specify a name when you create your agent. Ooh, that actually kind of makes sense for how we're doing this. So in here, we'll go ahead and give a name of document agent or document assistant agent. Okay. And then this one, our movie discovery assistant agent. There we go. And let's try that again. Restart the notebook. And let's see if we can initialize our supervisor. Looks like we can. Let's go ahead and run that request. And here we go. Looks like we can't name it that way. So let's try that again as document. And then I'll just do document dash assistant. And I'll get rid of the agent in there. Maybe it's underscore, but let's go ahead and just try it with the actual dash in there. Okay, try that, restart, and let's do that again. And here we go. And so there, it looks like we are getting something back. Look at the response, and your most 5 recent documents in here are looking good. User ID of 2. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and say something like, let's say change one of the documents with a duplicate title from a movie related to Mission Impossible. From May of 2025. Let's see how that works. Okay, so it's a fairly robust GPT model. And so this right here is quite a request. Created a new document titled Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning with content related to the movie. The previous documents with titles have been deleted. Wow, I didn't tell it to delete it, but it did delete it, which is interesting. Okay, So now, of course, we can verify this by going into the Python shell. And let's go ahead and do python manage.py shell. And then we'll go ahead and take a look at the different documents. So documents.objects.all, and I'll order by updated at, I believe. And we'll go ahead and do first. And there we go. Dead Reckoning Part 2, which is interesting that it called it that, because that's not the title any longer, but that's the title it used. Interesting. And then we'll go ahead and do the content itself. And there we go. Cool. So we now have a way to use two agents at once. And I would have to imagine we could probably add a lot more agents in here to do a lot more things. And notice the checkpointer still worked. So I could actually say something along the lines of, let's go ahead and grab this invoke statement here. And we'll say that it was called, I think the final reckoning was actually named the final reckoning. And we'll just go ahead and not dead reckoning part 2. Just run that. And let's see if it knows to update that documentation. I have no idea if it does, if it'll actually do it. What do you know? It did it. Cool. Let's go ahead and try that again. I'll do that quick search, do a title. There it is. That is awesome. That worked way better than I would have even guessed. But of course it did. All of these AI tools are getting really, really good. And then having all these different agents are also really good. The one thing that's not really good is the fact that the agent itself tried to delete things. It literally deleted some documents. I didn't ask it to do that. We need to put in some guardrails and permissions to both the users and the agent. When it comes to using an AI or any sort of LLM managing a database, we need to make sure that we have guardrails in place. We need to make sure that we are actually doing the correct thing at the correct time. And one of the ways we do that is with better permissions. In this case, we're going to be doing role-based access control, or RBAC for short. So let's go ahead and lay out the scenario first and see if these permissions fail at the point that we're at. So what I want to do here is I'm going to set up this notebook, and what I've got is a document ID and a user ID. So the user ID of 2, document ID of 24. So if I go into the Django admin, the user ID of 2 is staff, that's the username. And then if I go into my documents and I look at the document ID of 24, this is my document. Granted, you're going to have to change it depending on what your database says, but the idea here is the user and the document are all existing. So if I were to use that user ID and say, what are my recent documents, and run through that call, I should probably see that welcome to the Django one in there. That ID is going to be correct. Okay. So what I want to do now, though, is I want to change the user ID, but keep the document ID in here and do something along those lines. At this point, I probably may or may not have any documents. It looks like I have no documents. Do you want me to create someone or something like that? Okay. So now what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and invoke a new thing. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to go ahead and say, delete the document with ID. And I'll go ahead and use string substitution here. And I'll go ahead and use that doc ID as an example, right? So this is not the user one's document, but I'm going to go ahead and try and delete it anyway. So I'll go ahead and delete these things here. And so there's a good chance here that we get an error, right? So document with ID does not exist. It does exist, but the way we set up our code is basically telling us that it doesn't, right? So inside of our documents, we got delete document here. The tool itself is looking based off of the owner ID. Great. So it's saying it does not exist, which is sort of accurate. It doesn't exist based off of those queries, but what if we change this, right? What if we actually did want to have multiple people to have access to this document? I remove that user ID, we save it, and let's go ahead and restart our notebook here. And then I'm going to go ahead and run it now. And this time, it should delete that document, even though this user may or may not have permission to delete this document. But it is now deleted. So this is the rationale behind having some guardrails in place. So what can we do to make sure that this works? Well, on one hand, maybe we do want this user to have access to delete that document, right? That is certainly a permission that we might want to add in. Now, how would we do this at the database level? At the database level, we would have to adjust the document to make sure that it includes users that have permissions. Like, let's say, for instance, other users, right? We would do something like models.many-to-many field, and then we would use users again. And then this also bears in the question of what permissions, right? There's a lot of muddying that can start to happen when we rely inside of a Django model like this to add in permissions. So we want it to be quite a bit more generic. We want to be able to change permissions as we see fit so that maybe we allow for these deletions to happen, maybe we don't. Now, of course, this can work inside of AI, but it can also work inside of just standard Python in general. So we can do it in both places. And that's really the key here as to what we want to do. We can do it in AI tools. We can do it in our different, lookups and stuff like that. So we could do it on the client level as well. We would just need to pass in a user ID most likely, or some sort of identifier. There's a lot of different places on how we can actually lock this down to make sure that we have the correct permissions based off of the user. And each user would then have roles associated to them. So they could be a manager, they could be a viewer, they could be an editor, they could be all of those things. We just want to make sure that we have all of that in place. And this is a key reason as to why. Maybe we want to allow this document to be deleted, maybe not. Let's start the process of actually implementing RBAC, or role-based access control, for this entire system. We're now going to talk about roles, resources, and permissions. Let's start with resources because at the fundamental level, this is what our role will have access or permission to use. So the actual resource, let's go ahead and do resources as a list. We are going to eventually iterate over this list and create actual resources and permissions in the very near future. So we'll start with just one single resource. We'll put a dictionary in here and we're going to give it a name of some kind. So in my case, I'm going to name it simply document. Now, of course, the reason I'm naming it document has everything to do with the fact that I have a model named document. This model is what we want to start granting permissions to. So this is a resource. Now, another thing that's a resource is going to go back into our movie discovery tools in here, right? So these are also resources as well. So we've got movie detail and search movie. So there's a lot of things as far as what we could document more about this, but basically the actual, client itself, these are examples of resources. So maybe something like movie discovery resource, something along those lines, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and copy that as well, and then we'll go back in here. So I'm going to do another one in here as well, and we'll go ahead and say name, and I'll just call this the movie discovery resource. Great. So a big part of the reason that I'm going to manually have these and not store them in my Django database is so that I can check them into Git and see the version control over time. More than likely, I would actually not have them in a notebook like this. Instead, I would put them in a Python file, but having them in a notebook is really practical for understanding how all of this stuff works, not as practical for production. So understanding how it all works is the key part of this. So now that we've got a name, what we want to have in each one of these is a unique key across our entire set of resources. Yet another reason to have just a whole list of those resources. And in this case, I'm going to give the key of just simply document. This is arbitrary. I'm making this one up. You can call it whatever you like, but I believe it needs to be in a slug format, as in it can't have spaces in here. Then in the movie resource one, I would do something like movie discovery. And now we've got two resources, or at least the foundations for them. So the big question then is, what things do we want to do on these resources? Now, we already have some indication as to what we might want to do by taking a look at our AI tools. So inside of our document here, we've got search, we've got list, we've got get, create, update, and delete. So those gives us a really good idea as to all of the things we might want to do. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm also going to declare the actions we want to allow for. And this is going to be a dictionary value as well, so that we have key value pairs for these actions. More on this very, very soon. But the idea here is within these actions, we can actually start building out what we might want. So I did say search. So search was an action. I also said list, list also an action, and then I did get. Now, before I go to the other ones, let's think about these 3 items. What are they all actually doing? Well, they are all actually reading from the database. They are doing a lookup in the database and just retrieving that data. They're just retrieving them in different ways. Now, we could always separate these actions out like this if we wanted to add that granular permission. Let's say, for instance, the search action is only available to pro members, whereas the basic list and get works for free members or something like that, right? This is kind of what you would think about. You could use these as potential like additional benefits of upgrading your account. In our case, we're just going to have all 3 of them fall under the read category or the read action. Now, the other ones you might think, oh, well, since we're doing read, we might as well do write as well. So read and write, these are like pretty fundamental like permissions when it comes to using stuff. But I actually want to do it a little bit differently. I want to have create, I want to have update, and I want to have delete, right? So again, you can decide these things for yourself. So here are the actions we're going to do. Now, before I go any further, what I will say, these actions will then now correspond to new permissions, right? And so we can put a permissions list in here, and I may or may not use this list in the future, but for now, we'll go ahead and do it. So first off, we declare the resource, which is of course document, and more specifically, the resource key that we just created. Then we can also go ahead and grab that resource and then do a colon, and then go ahead and grab the action you want to allow for. So of course you could then repeat this process to get all of those actions, in which of course we will very soon. Now, this same thing is true for our movie discovery. This one's a little bit different though. So in our movie discovery, we have a way to search movies as well as a way to get the detail for the movie. So we only really have 2 actions for this API service itself. So in this case, we would come back in here and we would do the same sort of idea. And then we'd come in here and we would do maybe search and detail, right? So again, the 2 functions that we have in here. These, of course, can still be bundled in as just simply read, but when it comes to this third-party API service, it actually makes sense, I think, to have these actions corresponding to the actual tool itself. It also makes sense to have them corresponding to other actions, so the permissions across your entire system are very similar or almost identical. So it's going to be up to you on how you go about doing that. So we've got search and detail in here, and then read up here. Those are all basically the same sort of idea. But I want to show you different ones so you can just see how you might divert it. And of course, this one would then be something along the lines of doing movie discovery and let's say search. And then we would do movie discovery and let's say detail, right? And so those are 3 different permissions. These are read-only permissions at this point, right? So we've got read-only permissions here, which is pretty cool. But the question is, how do we actually assign these read-only permissions to users? The way you do that is with something called a role. So we're going to come in here and say roles. Now we're going to define, very similar to how we did our resources, we're going to define different roles. So the roles themselves, so once again, you can say a name. Let's go ahead and say like the owner or manager of the resource. In this case, we would then also have a key as well. And then we can say the manager, same sort of key as we saw before up here with those resources. And then we would also have maybe another kind of role. Let's go ahead and add one in. This role is going to be maybe, we'll go ahead and do a name, and I'll go ahead and say this one is a viewer. Like they can only view things, and key being view or viewer. Great. Okay. And so this is like free tier user maybe, or pro tier user. You could think of it that way as well. You could also have a role for the owner or like the super user of your entire system if you wanted to, but I'm just going to keep it as these 2 roles to make it nice and simple for us. So the real question is, which one of these would have read-only permissions? Well, of course, the viewer would have read-only permissions, in which case we would come in here and we would declare permissions, and then we would want a list here. What do you know? I actually already wrote that list out, and there are those permissions right there. Read-only permissions. And then the same idea with our manager, but now we probably want to have not just the read-only permissions, but everything else, right? And so everything else would be the document and then, what was it? Create, update, and delete. So again, these permissions correspond to what we want to allow to happen with any given resource. So we now have the fundamental of what we're going to do. These read-only permissions are not something we need anymore. That was more of an example of what we would eventually do with our roles. So all we really need are resources and roles to be able to start granting access. So of course, we now need to implement these things in a meaningful way. So how do we actually go about doing that? Well, that brings us to the next part of integrating with permit. So now that we've laid out resources, roles, and permissions, we want to actually implement the service that will enforce these things when we do our calls. And of course, we're going to be using permit for that. So be sure to sign up for a free account right now. You're going to test this thing out and see if it's for you. Now, the idea here is once you sign in, you're going to see something very similar to this. Create a workspace as you see fit. And then we're going to go ahead and jump into the development mode. That's what we're going to be building off of. Now, the first thing that I want to do is jump into settings, grab some API keys in here, and we're going to go ahead and create an environment API key. And I'm going to go ahead and just keep it into the default project, default development environment, and I'll give it a name of learning how to RBAC. Okay, something like that, just so that I know, hey, I could delete this at any time. So go ahead and reveal this key. I'm going to go ahead and copy it, and we're going to bring it into our .env file here. And we're going to go ahead and put it right underneath here, and we're going to do the permit API key, and we'll set it just like that. And since I'm doing it here, I'm also going to go ahead and put it into my sample and the permit API key. Okay. So now that we've got this, we can now jump into the permit docs. So what we want to do here is we want to use the permit docs inside of our project. So what we're going to do with that is we're going to go into help, into docs, and then we will navigate into using the Python SDK. So under Connect Your App, we've got Python here, and we've got this Python Quick Start. So if we take a look at this Python Quick Start, the first thing that we already did was the API key, right? So we did that one just now. Next up, we need to set up our policy decision point container. Well, we're actually going to be using the cloud policy decision point, but really when you go into production, you'd use an actual container for this. This has to do with the fact of latency. You want the decision maker microservice to be right next to your application, which is why you would end up using the container. You can do it on your local machine. You can do it in a lot of deployment options that are out there as well. Pretty much most deployment options have container support. We're going to be using Cloud PDP mostly so that we can test this thing out. And then we're going to be building out our own little client very similar to this. But this, of course, is not Python right here. But we do want this URL right here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this URL, and we're going to jump into our .env again. And this is going to be our permit PDP endpoint is what I'll call it. You could also call it a URL maybe just to make it a little bit more clear that it is a URL, full URL. There we go. Okay, so that's going to be the one I'm going to use. Now I want to create the client for it. So inside of our SRC here, I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder. I'm going to call this My Permit. And then I'll go ahead and create an init file here. And then I'll go ahead and create client.py. Now, the reason I'm calling it My Permit is because you may remember we installed the package called permit. So we did pip install permit-upgrade, or that's the package that we're using, in which case we don't want those names to conflict, which is why I'm calling it My Permit. Now, the movie database client itself might have to change to the movie database as well. But of course, that's not something I'm going to worry about right now. So all I want to do here is I want to implement my own client. We're going to go ahead and do from Django.conf. We're going to import settings. The reason I'm importing settings, of course, is because in my environment variables, I added these two items, which means I want to jump back into settings.py and add those two items as well and put them in as environment variables inside of my Django configuration, just like we talked about with the movie database. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and now add these ones in here like this. The default for the permit the actual permit PDP could probably stay as this URL right here. So feel free to go ahead and copy that and bring that into settings as well. That's totally fine for your backup. Okay, so the only thing I need to make sure that I did was in my actual environment variables. If I have quotes, they're on either side. If I don't, then they're not. Okay, so looks like we're good. Okay, great. So now that I've got this, I'm gonna go ahead and set it, save it, and then now we're going to go ahead and define get permit client. And it's going to return something. And of course, we've got our PDP URL, which is going to be settings.permit PDP URL, and then I'll go ahead and say my API key equals to settings dot, and then the permit API key. I believe those are the correct ones. Let's just do a quick search or copy either one, and sure enough, those are them. Okay, great. So now all we need to do is bring in from permit, we're going to import the permit class here, and we'll just go ahead and initialize this class with that PDP URL, and then also the token itself, which is of course the API key. Now I do want to run an error. So basically, if not the API key, we'll go ahead and raise a value error or maybe an implementation error and say something like, the permit API was not set in Django settings, something like that. Great. Okay, so now we've got our permit client that we'll be able to use. So I'm just going to do sort of a hello world here inside of my roles. I'm going to go ahead and bring that one in. And actually one more thing here is I'll go ahead and call this permit client equals to the initializing of that get permit client, just like that. And then in my init method, I'll go ahead and bring that one in and then put it into our all here. There we go. Okay, so now into my notebook, I want to bring that permit in, which I will do with going from my permit, import the permit client. Great. And so if I also want this to match with the actual permit API, I would just do a lowercase permit being the same thing. So this is going to go directly with the Python SDK examples that you would see right there. Okay, so I just want to make sure I've got that, and we'll restart this and run it. There we go. And then the next part of this, just to verify, is I'm now going to do await permit.api.users.list. And let's go ahead and run that. And what we've got is no users just yet. Of course we haven't done anything with those users. But now that we've got this API client in place, and it seems to be working in terms of actually getting data from permit, let's start the process of actually creating our resources and roles, and then maybe even add in a user to one of those things just to verify. Let's go ahead and add our users into permit. Of course, these are going to be our Django users, and at the bare minimum, we just need to give some sort of unique identifier so that permit knows who this user is, and we can do something like await permit.check, and then saying the user ID, so user ID 1, some sort of action like read, and then some sort of resource that we don't have yet, but one we will add in. And so that we could call this right here. And so the first step of that, of course, is to make sure that our users are even in there before we add this other stuff. So for that reason, we're going to go ahead and do from django.contrib.auth. We're going to import the get user model method here, and we're going to go ahead and declare that user model, and then we'll go ahead and do our little iteration after that. And so the iteration is going to be straightforward. It's going to be for you in user.objects.all, and then we'll just go ahead and print out all of the users we have. Of course, I only have 3 users, and each 3 has its own identifiers. It actually has 2 of them. One is the username, the other one is the actual ID. So we can really think about what kind of key we want to have or what kind of identifier we want to have for any given user. So I'm going to go ahead and say user data equals to, well, we need to start off with just simply key. Now, we could do it in this format where it's kind of like this down here, or I could just use the user ID, which is what I'm going to do. It's u.id. Now, keep in mind that if you had multiple tenants, so if you were using a Django project with something like Django tenants, and you had companies, different company names. So let's go ahead and say something like tenant name equaling to CFE or Django or whatever. You would potentially use this tenant name in conjunction with it, right? So you'd probably do something like this if you had unique users across all of those tenants and you wanted to use the same permit for all of that. So for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about with tenants, don't worry about it. We'll talk about it a little bit more when we take a look at permit in just a moment. But the idea here is, here's the minimum user data that I've got. Now I just want to add this user data into permit. So I'll do await permit.api.users.sync, and then we'll pass in this user data. And I can see what the response is. So we'll go ahead and say response equals to that. and then we can print it out. Now, for those of you who are not aware, a Jupyter Notebook uses a asynchronous property, which is why I can actually call await in here just like that. So these are all asynchronous functions thanks to Jupyter Notebooks. If we were doing this in a Python function, it'd be a little bit different, or a Python module, it'd be a little bit different than this, and we would have to use async IO or something like that. Another reason to model things inside of Jupyter Notebooks from my perspective. Okay, let's go ahead and run that, and what we see is a bunch of users being created. So if we go back into the permanent console here and go into directory under users, we see no users. And it says there are no users in this tenant yet. But if we go up to this default tenant and just go to all tenants, we see users now. So the way permit works is you have a unique user ID for your entire environment itself. If I switch environments, obviously I'm not going to have any users for the other environment. Going back into our development environment and switching to all tenants, what we've got here is literally all of them. And that's why I mentioned that you would put something like tenant in here if you have the user separated in some form. I've covered multi-tenant stuff before where they were separated completely, different database altogether. In this case, they're all in one place. So I'm going to go ahead and run that, and it's going to be syncing the exact same data. I could also put in something like the first name, and in this case, I'll just go ahead and do u.username, mostly so it just populates. It's not actually their first name, but that's what I'm doing. So if I come in here now and I take a look at one of the users and say edit, I should see most likely their name. I might have to refresh the page to make sure that that fills out. And there we go. So we've got user details in here, and that is the first name. Now, this is probably not something you would necessarily want to do by calling their first name their username. You would probably do it a different way, but the idea here is we've got that now synced up. And of course, if I were to combine the username with their key, this makes it a little bit more challenging later. We would have to know what their username is when we want to do this check. And of course, if I wanted to make my permissions or my agent a third-party microservice or separate it out as its own microservice where it's not connected to Django at all, this becomes a lot more challenging when we want to go do the check. So I'm going to stick with just the single user ID. Now, this also means that at some point, maybe in my Django project, I want to have a custom user with a UUID as the ID, which you totally, absolutely can do, and it's probably something well worth doing. The reason we're talking about it now is because as you start going down this permissions rabbit hole, you want to make sure that you actually have a really robust key here. As you can see, on the permit side, the ID that they're using is a UUID, so you might consider doing that now with your users as well. But even with that in mind, I now have this user ID here, and so at any point with any of my users, I can just come in here and grab an ID and pass in something like, check read document. And of course, right now it doesn't work just yet, but we will want it to work. We need it to work. The way we do that is by adding resources, then adding roles, then assigning roles to those users. Now let's go ahead and add in our resources into permit. So the way we're going to do this is by creating a asynchronous function. This is going to be async get or create resource. And it's going to take in some sort of resource data. So we'll call this our resource data. And it's going to be a dictionary value that will come through in there. And then we want to eventually return back some sort of data related to a resource. So why am I doing get or create? Well, realistically, I want to move towards update or create. So if I ever make any changes to any of these resources, it will update those changes. Very similar to like doing this sync call up here, but the way we're doing it is a little bit more deliberate inside of our project, which I'm going to call it get or create at this point, because I'm not planning on changing these resources, at least with code at this time. So the first thing that I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and try to get the resource itself. So we'll go ahead and do a try block. We'll do underscore resource equals to await. Now, the only reason that I have await here is because of how the permit API works or the SDK works, but also that's why I have async function up here as well, if that wasn't clear. So we'll go ahead and do permit.api.resources, and then this should be resources.get. Okay, so what is it that I'm looking for here? Well, it's always going to be something like the resource key. and this is going to be inside of our resource data. We're going to go ahead and get the key itself. Hey, what do you know? We've got a key right here. Up here, we've got this user data key. So this is a very common theme across Permit, is you'll have a key that's going to be unique across whatever that item is. In this case, it's a resource, before is users, and then eventually it's going to be roles as well, just to reiterate that. And so when we want to look up a resource, we can do it by that key itself. So I'm going to just go ahead and say accept and then pass for now, and then we'll return back this resource. So what I want to do is I actually want to just test and verify this part works itself by using it. So we'll go ahead and do await that resource, and then I'll go ahead and pass in some data with the key of simply document, right? And so of course, if I do this now, I would eventually get nothing. So let's go ahead and actually put this in as none for now. Try that again, and nothing comes back. Okay, so jumping into the actual console, we can create a resource ourselves by going into policy, going into resource, create a resource, and this one, hey, what do you know? It's already called document. The key itself, I'll do lowercase itself. Notice it says use it when working with the API, which of course is what we're doing. And then it's got all of the actions we've already put. I will actually do this manually to start. So we'll go ahead and save this. And I spelled document incorrectly, so we maybe need to edit that one. Let's go ahead and do that. And I can't edit it. So let's go ahead and just use that, for example, weird document. Okay, so now if I call it, it now gives me that resource. And it should have some actions in here as well. We see when it's created, when it was updated, and so on and so forth, right? And so there's action block, delete, and so on. Great. So that's essentially how we would end up doing this. I don't want that resource manually. I'm going to go ahead and change this a little bit myself. So I'll delete that resource right there. So instead, what I'm going to do is if the resource does not exist, then I'll go ahead and do await permit.api.resources.create. And this time it's going to be the entire data. So, hey, what do you know? Very similar to sync, but instead of sync, it's just simply create. Okay. And so this is where I could say something like exists being true. And then down here, it'd be something like exists being false. And then basically something along these lines, we would then say if exists, then we might want to update that resource itself with other data, right? And so you would do something like update, which I'm not going to do right now, but that is something you could build in at some point. Okay, so the idea though with this get or create is I want to make sure that I'm actually doing the correct exception here. So not just always creating it if there's an exception with the lookup, but rather having a very specific one, which will be from permit. We're going to import the permit API error. And so we want to catch this exception, and we'll say as E. Then we'll go ahead and say if e.status code equals to 404, then we'll go ahead and create it. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and raise the exception itself, the original exception, and not handle anything else. So basically, if it does not exist, which is what that 404 is for, then we would go ahead and create it. So now we just need to move through our resources. So in here, we'll go ahead and do for resource data inside of the resources list, which was this right here. I can now just pass in that resource data just like that. We can look at the response itself and we can print out what that response is, which should give us two resources. Let's make sure that we've got everything ran, or every cell ran in here with just shift enter. And sure enough, it's creating each resource. And there we go. We've got our key of document and our key of movie. So back into our project here, we take a look, and after giving it a moment, I refreshed, and then there are my new resources in there. And of course, if I open these up, I can see the actions I declared. So the nice thing about using permit in this case is those actions are definitely arbitrary, and we can change them as we see fit. And then we could also even add more if we want to as well. So if you wanted to have detail in here too, you could absolutely do that, in which case when you save it, it will update that resource and it's right in there, right there, right? And then of course you could always delete that action as well, edit it. You can do all sorts of things with it all together inside of the console too, which is pretty nice. So that's part of the reason I don't have the update portion inside of here. I really just want to go ahead and create these, make sure they're there. And once they are there, I want to be able to actually call them as I see fit. But now at this point, we want to get the process going, similar process with the policies themselves. Now that we've got the get or create resource, let's go ahead and do the same thing with get or create role. So we'll go ahead and do that now. Role, and this is going to be role data. And once again, we'll go ahead and pass role all around. And this time I'll just go ahead and use underscore key in there like that. And this is going to be roles and roles. There we go. So what we want to see, of course, is we've got a key in here for the role. The permission has the resource that has already been created with the action that has already been created as well. So naturally, this process needed to happen after doing all of the actual resources themselves. So now for role data in roles, we'll go ahead and do our response being await get or create role of that role data. And then we'll go ahead and print out that response as well. And then we'll just go ahead and run it. And this is very simple, very straightforward on how this ends up working with the various permissions for the various things. And of course, you just want to make sure that everything is correct in here in terms of the key, name, and permissions are actually available. I think that it would probably run an error if you use the permission setup incorrectly. But now that we've got these roles in here, we can look back into our actual console, and what we should be able to do is refresh in here on the various roles for our permissions. We've got manager and we've got viewer, right? And so it just so happens that this viewer name and this manager are just slightly different, but we can also get rid of admin and editor if we want to, right? So we can delete that role altogether. So delete admin and delete editor. Great. So now we've got resources and roles, and only 2 roles at that. I'm not actually sure why this role name wasn't capital viewer. Maybe something with, yeah, that says capital viewer. Not sure why it did that. But nevertheless, we've got our 2 roles in here now. It's just a matter of now assigning these roles to our users and then doing that permission stuff. Let's take a look. So I now want to assign a role to my user. So I'm going to go ahead and redo all of my permissions in here and just make sure that everything's up and running. One of the things I noticed is my viewer has no permissions in here. So this is kind of odd because the viewer should have permissions in there. So all I'm going to do is delete that role itself. So we'll go ahead and grab this await here, and I'll go ahead and do delete, and the key was simply viewer. I'm going to go ahead and run that, and then I'll comment it out. Now I'll go ahead and run this again, and we'll see that now it does have those permissions. And of course, you could verify this as well by going into your policy. And right now I still have the old version cached. If I refresh in here, I should be able to see the new version being set up. And there we go. Great. So the reason I caught this is what we're about to do, which is assigning a role to a user. So once again, I should have user.objects.all in here. So I should be able to do that. I'm going to go ahead and grab my first user. I'll say user equals to all of those, and we'll just go ahead and say first. Okay. So I want to assign a role. The way we do this, I'll just go ahead and say response equals to await, and this is going to be permit.api.users.assign role, and we add in some data here. The first one is going to be our user, so that's going to be our unique identifier. My unique identifier was user.id, right? Then we're going to go ahead and add in our role. Like, what role do we want to use? I'm going to go ahead and say viewer for now. And then we also need to include tenant. There is another option here, but we're going to go ahead and just use the default tenant for right now. So default tenant. Okay. So with this in mind, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at that response. And there we go. So if I had many different tenants, like if I had the CFE tenant or tenant 1 or tenant 2, I would want to create or assign a role for this same user across the board. So you want to have all of those roles in there if you intend to use these permissions, which of course is what I recommend. Okay, so now that we've got this, let's go ahead and actually finally check this thing out. So I'm going to go ahead and just add in here. We'll go ahead and do await permit.check. Once again, that same exact, user ID here. Then we want to check an action. What can this user do? We're going to go ahead and say read and document, right? So that's the resource. So action, resource. Run that, and we should get a true back. Fantastic. And sure enough, we do. If I unassign this role, right away, I get a false back. Makes sense, right? There we go. And the other part about this, if I wanted to make changes to that role, I could just jump into permit and go into the viewer role and say, oh, you cannot read documents anymore. Save those changes. And then sure enough, that role has changed. So now when I go to check it, it's going to say false, right? Or if I wanted to create a document, false, right? And so at this point, I could then go ahead and bring it back and say save. Or if I'm like, oh, I want to make a brand new role, a brand new policy, I'm going to go ahead and first off start with a new role in here. I'll go ahead and say admin, and we'll just go ahead and use that key of admin. There we go. So we're going to save that, right? And so that should give me a new role in here with this admin. Going back into the policy editor, I can just select everything. Allow all, save changes. My manager now cannot delete anything, right? So we can just come in here and just make these rapid changes just like that, and it will propagate to my other users. So if I were to assign the role of admin to this user, now I can see that, yes, they definitely have that. If I unassign this role of admin to this user, they don't have that any longer. Let's see if they can view or rather read that document. It's still true because their other role did not go away, right? So they still have the view role in here. And of course, we could just jump into our directory and we can see all of the different roles that they might have, right? And so roles per tenant, right now the default tenant is this one. If I were to remove it, that user now no longer has access to do whatever that is, which is pretty fantastic if you ask me. Now, with this in mind, we could always expand this to have other tenants. We can also do something like instance roles, which means that do they have access to do X, Y, or Z to that item? That is another thing that we could do. But you can see very rapidly, we can add new policies, new roles, new resources. We can do all of that in the console. I think having it in the code is nice to see exactly what's going on. But at any time, if you needed to just rapidly change something about a user, you could definitely do that. And so in the directory, we did that, right? So we actually went in here and we are going to grab our default tenant, and then we just add the role of admin. So right away, we can just say, hey, what's your username? Let me just go ahead and make sure you have access to do that. And boom, now they have access without changing anything else in your code other than initially having these checks in there, these checks and balances for what we need to do, which I think is really cool. So now that we've got this, we can absolutely start putting these in, whether it's API calls, whether it's in our views, or whether it's in our actual AI systems themselves, which is pretty cool. Let's go ahead and implement RBAC, the role-based access control guardrails, into our AI agent. First and foremost, we need to make sure that we have access to the permissions. So let's go ahead and run this inside of our notebook. Make sure all your permissions are in there. And then at the very end, you can assign the role of viewer in here, and then you can verify whether or not they can view it. So what we want to do is we want to use this same concept inside of our actual AI tools. So where these would be called, you could obviously expand the resources to other things. Like, do you even want to allow for them to be able to call a supervisor at all? Obviously, you could do that as well. But what I want to do is get a little granular with the actual document reading and all that. Because, of course, we can't create documents in here as well, right? So that's a false, or even try to update documents, also a false. But we can read them. So let's try this one out. What that means is I need to copy this right here, and I want to bring it into documents, and I'm going to go ahead and do it into search, list, and git. So in this case, I'm actually going to be rewriting the code over and over. I think in the long run, I would probably want to change these tools into being a class, but I want to be as explicit as possible so everyone can break this down, look at the code itself, and improve upon it later. So inside of the search one, I'm going to go ahead and come in here and do this call. Now notice that it says await. Now the tool itself, I could probably turn to being asynchronous, but that might cause other issues in here that I did not account for. So instead, what I want to do is I want to turn this call into a synchronous call. Now, the way we do this is actually built into what we've already installed, and that is going to be from asgiref.sync. We're going to import the async to sync call in here. And I can just use this. I wrap it around the function, this right here, put parentheses around that, and instead of await, we just use async to sync. And then we do the rest of it as well. So naturally, the user ID is going to be the one that's configurable. So I'll go ahead and use that as my string substitution. I can still treat it as a string. That's totally okay from permit. And then, of course, I need to import my permit client. So the way we're going to do that, of course, is going to be right underneath documents. We'll do from my permit. We're going to import permit client as permit this time. And so now we can actually see that that part is working. So we'll go ahead and say something like has perms equaling to that. And we want to do this before we even do our lookups, which of course makes sense because we might get rid of this as a default lookup. Maybe we don't want the owner ID on here at all. Maybe our entire application, we just want to go based off of whether or not they're permitted to do these lookups inside of the actual AI itself. So we might just get rid of that altogether is the point, right? And basically in here then we would say if has perms, or rather if not has perms, then we will go ahead and say raise exception, and we'll say you do not have permission to do this or to search the documents. Something along those lines. This exception, the AI will read. It will read about it, which is why we're also having that in there. So we can take this same concept down to our list documents in here. Once again, we've got our user ID in here. I can paste that in. I can now, of course, get rid of the owner ID in here if I want to be able to see all of those documents again. Now, this is one of those places where we might think of additional permissions we might want to add in terms of the actual lookup itself. So that is another thing to think about as well. We can see what role they are and all that. So it's completely up to you on how you do that query from here on out. But the idea here is I just want to do these basic permissions. Next up, what we want to do is go down into the get document. Once again, we've got our user in here. Then I'll go ahead and bring this in here just like that. Once again, I'll get rid of the owner ID as argument for the get lookup. And this is going to be, you do not have permission to get, individual documents, or you do not have permission to list all documents, something like that. Okay. So granted, at this point, you should know enough to be able to do the create, update, and delete as well. But of course, we can always just grab that same thing. So that has permitted, has perms underneath this user ID, assuming that it's in there. Once again, we'll now go ahead and do create. You do not have permission to create individual documents, and so on. Update and update. Okay. And then finally, of course, delete. And there we go. Great. So now let's try this out. So going back into our roles and permissions notebook, I need to restart it so it flushes out everything in this tool, assuming that you saved everything in there. Now what I want to do is run through it again. We don't need to do all the setup process necessarily. We might want to just sync our users and make sure our roles are in there. But realistically, the only one I need to look at right now is assigning the role. So right now, the role is assigned. True, the user has access. I'm going to now unassign that role. Now, if I run this multiple times, it's going to run an error because of course it does. It runs an error because this particular user does not have this particular role, in which case you wouldn't want to run it multiple times. Okay. So now if we look and check this, we can see this user does not have access to read it, create it, or anything, right? It's just empty, no permission whatsoever. So now with our AI supervisor, using that user, we just want to make sure in here we've got a user ID of 1. Let's make sure our server is running, and sure enough it is. I'm just going to make sure that that user has some documents. So I'm going to go ahead and create another document in here. I'll say another, and I know my user ID of 1 is this user, and I'll just go and say some doc. We'll go ahead and save it. And sure enough, now I have some documents in there. So what are my recent documents with that user ID of 1? Again, verify all those things manually as you see fit, or you can do it automatically with importing the document and just creating one for this user. Let's go ahead and take a look. We run this, and so what we should see is basically something along the lines of, I'm unable to access your document. You need to get permission. That's essentially what's happening. Let's go ahead and add permission now. So back up to our unassigned role. Let's go ahead and assign that role. We just added permission. Of course, we could do this in the permit console as well. We can verify that that permission's in there. Now I can do that same exact call again. And what we should see is we should see the actual documents come back based off of the AI response. And sure enough, there it is. We've got 2 documents in here, or a few, or actually, now I can see all of the documents. It's not even my recent documents. It's what are the recent documents because of how we modified the list itself, right? Of course, it doesn't have the user ID being filtered here any longer, which may or may not be what you want to do, of course. But there we go. So now let's go ahead and try and delete that document. Let's see. Let's grab a document in here. Let's go ahead and delete. How about we delete any random document? Let's see if we have that by ID. Not sure if the context came through or it remembers that context, but it should because the tool itself responds back with the title and the ID. And so what we should see here is that we do not have permission to delete documents. Great. So how do we actually add that permission? Well, again, we assign the role. This time the role is going to be of manager. We run that. Now we can say delete documents. Just check that one. Sure enough, it says false in here, which is interesting. So the user cannot delete that document. So perhaps we don't have that ability. Let's go ahead and see what our role has. We've got delete in here for that manager. That's interesting that it's saying delete is not valid. So let's go ahead and take a look at our roles for this user. Could be related to the other permissions. So let's go ahead and take a look. We've got a top level access here, looking at our user, and we might need a refresh in here for this user. And so, yeah, we've got two user roles in here. I'm going to take a look, and sure enough, we got viewer and manager. So this should absolutely work. Let's see if it does. Let's just go ahead and run it with our actual AI stuff and see if that ends up calling it. I don't think it shouldn't have any issue here with that user ID, but again, we don't have permission to do it directly. So let's just go ahead and do our unassigned role for our viewer here. And then assign role for the manager again. And let's go ahead and make sure we are printing out the correct user here. And we're working off of that user. Sure enough, it is that user. Okay, so we assign that role, permission check, delete. Okay, so something's going on with the permissions. Maybe our policy was changed for the manager. Yes, when we were playing around, that manager policy we removed because we did add that admin one. Great, the policies are working. Now let's go ahead and add the admin policy. Let's see if that ends up working. Now let's go ahead and try the delete. Sure enough, it works. There we go. Cool. It's nice to see errors in real time related to permissions, and we just need to dive in because we made those changes outside of the code, and there we go. Document with ID of 25 has been deleted. Let's go ahead and take a look. There's 6 documents in the cache right now. If I refresh, there's only 5. Let's go ahead and do another one. And once again, it's going to delete another one. Sure enough, it does. The API responses are going to take a little bit of time, as in the AI and doing all the things, but sure enough, it does delete it, which is pretty great. We now have those guardrails in place and they're ready to be used and expand upon. When you need object level permission, like a individual document and that document owner or multiple owners and multiple access, this is what we're going to implement now. This is called RBAC, which is a little bit more advanced than what we've done so far. So at this point, we have a directory of users, we have some policies in here and some resources. So at the resource level, we can add in additional permissions for them. And these are RBAC options, as in roles on this resource. So you can do something like an admin role in here, or like a viewer role, or like a manager role. And you could add all of those permissions in and save them. So as soon as you add those permissions in, you could go back into your policy editor and you can see those permissions available to that specific resource, right? So in the admin one, you would probably select everything, right? In the manager one, maybe you have create, read, update, but not delete. And the viewer one, maybe you only have read, right? So these are policies that work just like the other ones, and we will be able to see how they are checked in just a moment. But the idea here is you have different permissions now for individual resource instances. What I mean by resource instances are, of course, things that you've stored in your actual database that you've then synced with Permit, which we can take a look at right now in this bonus notebook. So the idea here is we, of course, do our standard imports here, and then I've also got a bunch of different users, right? So I've got my documents and my users. You might say something like your admin users, like is super user equaling to true? You know, you might run those queries here. Then you can do what's called a get or create resource instance. This should look very familiar to what you've seen before when it was creating resources and so on, but now we're passing in a Django instance. The reason I do a Django instance is because this is a fairly generic thing to do. In this case, the resource key is document, but you could think of it as like blog posts. You could think of it as pretty much any resource you might have stored in your Django project, in which case you then develop a unique key for that resource. Now, in this case, I definitely put the resource key first and then the resource instance second. So the idea, again, is the resource has to exist in general. The overarching resource has to exist before you have instance roles as well. We are creating an instance role and instance resource in general right here. And which is what's going on is we've got now we're creating this instance by using a Django instance and its ID. That's going to be the key we'll still store. Then we'll go ahead and use our resource key, right? This one right here. Then we'll go ahead and create that payload. So as you may notice, this key itself is going to be what we do our lookups with. And then beyond that, it would be used elsewhere. So this creates a resource instance. Then we can assign the user ownership based off of that data. So our Django user, whatever the Django object instance is, this could of course also be a Django user, but the idea is making that key again. And then we've got our resource instance is going to be based off of that key, like I mentioned before. So we've got our user in here, we've got our role. This role I manually added, right? So that's this one right here. I did not have an automated process for creating those roles. Then we actually create the instance itself, right? So we add this all in to permit. And then all I'm doing here is iterating through all of those documents, my query set itself. Then I create the instance itself. Where this goes is inside of permit. You can go into your directory. You can look at your instances in here. And now you can see the resource type and the instance itself, right? Which is great. It also shows the tenant as well. Now, there are more advanced things that you can do in here as well. Right now, we're just focusing on that single instance itself. Great. So then I assign the ownership to the object owner, the document owner. They get admin privileges here, right? That makes a whole lot of sense in terms of how we end up doing this. We do that with all of our documents in this case, but I could also do this again with all the admin users, right? So I could say something like this, where it's for admin user in admin users, and then I could iterate through all of them, right? So is super user. What I would do here is then also iterate through all of those documents once again, and then tab this on over. And then instead of using the object owner here, I would use the admin user, which of course could still be the same user. And in many cases, it will be the same user, but this gives me now admin privileges all across the board. So let's go ahead and run some of these in here and see if that ends up doing it. And I think it will. It might actually duplicate some of the things in here. We will see. Okay. And it looks like we got an error with our last step, which would be checking our users, which we'll take a look at in a moment. But there we go. We've got all of our user data in here from the different responses and from the different documents that are in there. I only have one admin user anyway at this point, but if you had a bunch of them, this would be a way you could do that. Of course, you could also do it manually in permit as well. But the idea then is we get a random user and then we want to do a random check. I run this. This is how you would end up checking it, but we get an SDK error at this time because of the PDP container. It does not support these RBAC or these more specific policies that we have in here, which would be the instance-based policies. In order to use the instance-based policies, we need to bring our own PDP, our own local authorization microservice. The reason for this is because when you go into production, you're going to need one of these as well. And you might have a lot of these. You can have a lot of them to get no latency. So it's much faster than what we've been doing so far, even though it has been already really fast. So there's a bunch of different policy types. What we just did was RBAC, ABAC and RBAC, or attribute-based access control, is another one that requires you to have a microservice running, which is just a Docker container, and you can absolutely implement this right now. You would use that same API key that we've had. You could put in debug on there, And then basically you would end up having a different URL for yours, which would use this right here. And you could always go through this documentation, but here is the URL that you would probably end up having for your RBAC instead of the cloud one, which is what we've been doing. That's the only reason I am not actually fully implementing this at this time, is because I didn't set all of that up, but it is something that you would then check like this. So this is super cool. You can now have very specific IDs for any given resource. Of course, the resource in general is something you can still check as well, but as soon as you add in that key there, the colon, and then the actual value in there, that will then go to the resource instance, which gives you very, very granular control over this data. This is where then you might come back into the, let's say, delete document tool, the AI tool itself. Then you might actually do, instead of has perms right here, you might do it a little bit later before you go and delete it, right? So you might come down here, grab this in here, paste this here. And let's say, for instance, they have general permissions to delete. Now down here, we can say has delete perms or has object perms, right? Like that. And then you would grab the object ID. You would just change this out here. And then you would put that object.id in there. And then boom, you would now say, hey, it does not have object permissions to do this. So they might have general document permissions, but they have no permissions to this particular document, which gives you a lot more granular control over what's happening right here. It is pretty simple to implement, as we see. The only difference is changing the PDP server, the policy, authorization server that you would need locally. This is a huge one because it will drastically improve your application's performance when it comes to these permissions. Now, when it comes to the AI tools, the ones we've been using, I think users are generally pretty accepting of it taking a little bit of time to solve things. But of course, we always want to increase the speed as much as we can. But that's it. That is what RBAC is. That is role-based instance control for a resource, an individual instance itself. The keys, once again, are the fact that the resource exists. The resource has instance roles itself. Those instance roles have their own policies and what they can do. And our directory has those instances for those resource types. So the key thing here is there's nothing about this data that is being exposed. It's literally just some sort of key or ID, which you could always create a brand new field specifically for these policies, and then the resource type. Again, this resource type does not need to be the same as the actual resource type that's in your actual Django project itself. But I think this is a really neat way to really lock down your system and really grant very granular permissions. Now, another one that you might end up looking at is called the attribute one. So creating an attribute-based control policy. This is another cool thing where you can do something like if someone lives in the United States or lives in Europe or lives in Germany, you can have those sort of attributes assigned to the different policies and the different access they can have. That's just outside the context and scope of what we're doing in this project. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you got a lot out of this. Now, I will say that Django does have a place in the world of AI tooling, as we've seen in this one. It can really help orchestrate everything that you're trying to do with AI agents. Now, there's a lot more that we could build out with Django itself and also LangGraph. So LangGraph itself is a tool that has a lot more capabilities than what we've done here. But the idea is we now have the groundwork in place to start building more and more complex applications, and doing so with permissions in mind, doing so to make sure that we have those guardrails in place going forward. Now, of course, your next big task would be how do you deploy this into production? That is something that I definitely am very interested in doing. If you are as well, please let me know in the comments. The more comments we get about that one, the more likely it is to happen. But thanks again for watching. Look forward to seeing you next time.